The night Nora Voss turned 16, nobody called. Not a text, not a card, not even the automated birthday email from the library system she'd signed up for 3 towns ago. Her foster mother, Linda Greer, set a black garbage bag outside Nora's bedroom door at 11:45 and said, calmly, that the placement ended at midnight. The way you announce a parking meter expiring. The way you remind someone to take their umbrella before they leave the house, nothing personal, just a matter of timing. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nora took the bag. She'd been in the system long enough to know that protests cost more than they returned. 6 years and 4 placements had taught her that slowly, through the particular humiliation of wanting something badly enough to ask for it, and being told the answer was complicated. She didn't ask. She picked up the bag, gathered her backpack from the closet, and walked out the door of Linda Greer's house on Elmore Street in Caldwell, Ohio, at 11:52 on a Tuesday night in December. That was 2 weeks ago. Now she stood on the corner of Melton and 4th at 11:15 at night, in a jacket that had been adequate in October and was failing badly at 18 degrees. The kind of cold that moves past your skin and starts working on your bones. She could feel it in her jaw, in the space behind her ears, in her fingers, which had stopped aching an hour ago and gone somewhere past aching into a particular numbness she understood, instinctively, was not good. Her backpack held what mattered. A worn copy of Jane Eyre, the same one she'd carried through 4 placements, its spine cracked and its pages soft from handling. A lighter with maybe 40 flicks left in it. $7.43. Half a granola bar she'd been dividing into thirds each day since Tuesday, because it was the only food she had, and she didn't know when she'd have more. She'd spent 3 nights in the Greyhound station before the night manager started watching her too carefully. 2 nights in a church vestibule before someone called the non-emergency line. 1 night in the back stairwell of an apartment building on 9th Street, cold enough to shiver through most of it, but warm enough to get 4 hours of sleep before a tenant found her and told her she had 2 minutes. The shelter on Broad Street had a waiting list. The family services office, where she'd walked in on day 4 still carrying the garbage bag, had a waiting list too, and a social worker named Mr. Patrice who'd looked at her file for roughly 40 seconds before saying that she'd technically aged out of dependent minor status and therefore fell under a different set of service categories. He said it the way you'd read a definition. Like no person was sitting across from him. Like the gap between placement and adulthood was simply a category rather than a corner on Melton and 4th at 18 degrees. She'd asked if there were emergency options. He'd given her a printed sheet. Resources for young adults in transition. Every line on it had a waiting list or a phone number that rang through to a full voicemail. She'd folded the sheet and put it in the front pocket of her backpack, behind Jane Eyre. She didn't know why she kept it. Maybe because throwing it away felt like surrender. Her mother, she didn't let herself think about her mother often. But sometimes the thought arrived before she could stop it. Her mother had always said you keep paper that matters, even paper that hurts. Paper is proof that something happened. She'd been 8 when her mother left. Not dramatically. There was no fight, no court hearing, no night her mother sat her down and explained that things were changing. Nora had come home from school one Thursday afternoon, and the apartment had been the same apartment it always was except that her mother's coat wasn't on the hook by the door. That was what she remembered first. The hook. The empty hook. Her mother always hung the coat on that hook when she was home. The neighbor, a woman named Gloria who smelled like cigarettes and kept a very clean kitchen, had taken Nora in for 4 days before calling the county. Gloria had been kind. The social worker who came on day 5 had also been kind. Most people in the system had been kind, in the way that professionals are kind with limits that were inherent to the role, with paperwork that traveled alongside the kindness like a shadow you couldn't shake. She'd cycled through placements the way children in the system did, not because she was difficult, but because the placements were temporary by design. A family in Perrysburg for 14 months. Then a family in Findlay for 8 months, before the father's job relocated and the placement ended. Then a group home in Westfield for 5 months, which was the hardest period not because anyone was cruel, but because 20 teenagers in a large house with institutional furniture and the specific sadness of a place designed for people who weren't staying that environment had a weight to it that she'd never been able to fully describe. Then Linda Greer's house in Caldwell, which had been, in all the ways that mattered, fine. Linda was a professional foster parent, one of the ones who did it long-term and seriously. The house was clean. The food was adequate. There were rules, but they were clear. Nora had her own room and her own small shelf for her books, and she'd been, by any reasonable measure, safe. But safe had always been temporary. That was the thing about the system that took years to really understand. The safety was real, but it was not permanent, and the difference between real and permanent, when you were a child, was everything. The cold was getting serious. Not dramatic, just serious. The kind of serious that required a decision before her fingers stopped working entirely. She walked. Caldwell wasn't a large town, which was both its problem and the one thing that might save her tonight. 7,000 residents, one diner open past midnight, a town center that mostly shut down at 9. She knew its layout from the 8 months she'd spent in Linda Greer's house, knew the pharmacy with the blue security light, the hardware store with the broken awning, the church whose steeple you could see from Linda's bathroom window if you stood at exactly the right angle. She paid attention. She always had. Her third foster mother, a woman named Diane who'd genuinely tried, had called it a gift. You notice things, Nora. That's rare. What Diane hadn't said, because she was kind and probably didn't see it clearly herself, was that noticing things was what you did when you couldn't control things. When the house you slept in wasn't yours, when the rules could change without warning, when the permanence of where you were standing was always provisional, you learned to read rooms. All the time. Every room. She noticed, when she rounded the corner of Main Street and turned down Hargrove Avenue, that the building at the end of the block still had its roof. The Hargrove Public Library. 3 stories of limestone, built in 1947, closed 3 years ago when the town voted to defer its maintenance budget and never quite undeferred it. The red door was still there, mostly under the boards. The windows were dark, half of them covered with plywood, the others intact but filmed with the particular opacity of glass that has gone unclean for years. A chain-link fence ran around the perimeter, 6 feet high, with a padlocked gate facing the street and a yellow sign. Condemned. No entry. Authorized personnel only. Nora stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. She'd passed this building dozens of times in the months she'd lived in Caldwell. Had registered it the way you register scenery. Condemned. She'd always heard the word with the implication of genuine danger, a building actively collapsing, a place where the floor would give and the ceiling would follow. But looking at the Hargrove Library now, in the thin glow of a streetlight 2 blocks down, she didn't see collapse. She saw neglect. She saw a building that had been told to stop trying. The walls were solid limestone, the kind of stone that didn't betray its age in any visible way, stone that simply got darker and quieter with time instead of weaker. The roof, what she could see of it in the dark, appeared intact. The stone steps up to the boarded red door showed no crumbling she could identify from the sidewalk. The fence, the chain, the plywood, those were the marks of a decision someone had made about what was worth maintaining, not the marks of a building that had given up on itself. Someone had decided this building wasn't worth the trouble. She had decided, standing there at 18 degrees with 43 cents and a half-empty lighter, that this was the wrong call. She walked the perimeter of the fence twice, methodical, not fast. The chain link had a weak point at the northeast corner where the tension had slackened and the fence leaned out by about 6 inches. Not a gap, but 6 inches of lean was enough if you were 16 and lean yourself and not particularly afraid of fences. She'd climbed worse at the group home in Westfield, where the backyard fence was the only route to the creek the other kids talked about. She checked both ends of the street. A car passed on the far block, headlights sweeping the asphalt but not reaching her. She waited until it was gone, then hooked her fingers into the chain link and pulled herself up, over, down. She landed soft on old frozen snow and stood still, checking herself. Nothing hurt. The courtyard between the fence and the building was dark. She crossed it quickly, rounded the side of the building, and worked her way to the back, where the library faced an alley between it and the old city records building. No streetlights reached this end. She used the lighter in short bursts, checking the windows along the rear wall. Most of the boards were solid. One wasn't. A ground floor window near the rear entrance had a board that had warped away from the frame at its bottom edge, leaving a gap of maybe 5 inches between board and sill. She pressed her fingers to it, pulled gently, worked it back and forth until the gap widened to about 7 inches. Enough. The window behind the board was unlocked. Probably had been unlocked for 3 years. She got it up, sat on the sill, swung her legs through, and dropped to the floor inside. Cold tile. Darkness. The sound of her own breathing. She stood completely still and listened. The first thing was the smell. Old paper and cedar, and something beneath both of those. Something she had no exact name for, like air that had been sitting still long enough to develop its own character. Not rot, not mold, or not much of it. Something quieter. The particular atmosphere of 10,000 books breathing slowly in a closed space. She'd been in libraries before, real ones, open ones, and they had a smell she'd always found calming. This was that smell, but concentrated, undiluted by people coming and going, by coffee from a cart or cleaning products applied each morning. This was what a library smelled like if you took the people away and let the books be alone with their pages for 3 years. It was warmer inside than out. Not warm, but the cold out there had been active and hostile, and the cold in here was different, settled, the cold of a space where heat simply hadn't been applied, not the cold of something predatory. Her body registered the difference before her mind fully processed it. She let her eyes adjust. The lighter she used in 3-second bursts, enough to build a picture in pieces. She was in the library's rear storage room. Shelves on 2 walls, mostly empty. A few boxes stacked in one corner. A door to her left, slightly open, the outline of the main floor beyond it. She moved through it. The main reading room of the Hargrove Library was larger than she'd expected. High ceilings with tin panels. Shelves rising on 3 sides, oak and solid. The plywood covered the street-facing windows, but the windows on the interior courtyard side were bare, and they let in the faint ambient glow of the December sky enough to see by, barely, the shapes of things assembling themselves in the near dark. The books were still there. All of them, or close to it. The town hadn't emptied the shelves when it condemned the building. Had apparently walked away and left everything 10,000 volumes standing in their places, gathering dust, waiting in the dark for someone who wasn't coming. She stood at the end of a row and looked down its length and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in a condemned library at midnight in the middle of December. She felt the particular relief of having arrived somewhere. She'd read Jane Eyre for the first time at 11. In the house in Perrysburg where the foster father traveled for work and the foster mother sat mostly in the kitchen with the radio on. The house had a bookshelf in the hallway, real books, not decoration, and Jane Eyre had been wedged between a legal thriller and a cookbook. She'd taken it to her room and read it in 2 days. Then read it again. When she was moved 6 months later, she'd put it in her bag without thinking too carefully about whether it was hers to take, because by then it was. Books, she'd learned, were one of the few things that traveled with you. Everything else, beds, kitchens, the particular angle of a bedroom window in the morning, those were always someone else's to take back. Books were yours if you carried them. Standing in the Hargrove Library now, with 10,000 books breathing around her in the dark, she felt the same thing she'd felt reading that first chapter at 11. The particular comfort of being surrounded by stored voices. The sense that even when a room held no people, it was not empty. She was going to stay. She didn't decide it consciously. It arrived as a statement of fact, already settled. Tonight, at least. She'd figure out the rest tomorrow. Tomorrow was its own problem, and she'd been solving tomorrow problems one at a time for 6 years. She found the back corner of the reading room, behind the last row of shelves on the east wall, where 2 leather chairs faced each other, cracked and dusty, but structurally sound. She moved one so its back was against the wall, sat in it, pulled her knees inside her jacket. She wasn't warm, but she was warmer. She took out Jane Eyre, held it in her lap without opening it. Outside she could hear wind. Inside she could hear the building settling, the structural conversation of old stone and timber that had been having the same conversation for 75 years. She found it, strangely, not frightening but calming. Like being inside something that knew how to endure. She ate the last of the granola bar. Then she sat in the dark library, alone, and waited to see if she could sleep. She slept. She woke to gray light coming through the courtyard windows. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was, which wasn't unusual. She'd woken in enough unfamiliar rooms that her brain had learned to gather information before reacting. Ceiling, high, tin panels. Walls with shelves. Books. The smell of paper. The sound of wind somewhere outside the stone. Then she remembered. She got up slowly, working out the stiffness of a knight in a chair, and moved through the rows of shelves to get the blood going. The light was gray and flat, the particular gray of December in Ohio that flattened everything to the same low register. But it was enough to see by. And what she saw, moving through the Hargrove Library in the early morning, was that the building was beautiful. She hadn't registered that the night before. Last night, she'd registered shelter and darkness and basic arithmetic. This morning, she could see what it had actually been before someone decided it wasn't worth the trouble. The shelves were solid oak, floor to ceiling, with rolling ladders on brass tracks that still looked serviceable. The reading tables down the center of the main floor were long dark wood, their surfaces scratched from decades of use but intact. A card catalog cabinet stood against the south wall, its dozens of small drawers still shut, still labeled in a looping hand. Along the far wall, the children's section, smaller shelves at a lower height, picture books still standing upright in their places, arranged by someone who'd cared about the ordering. She ran her fingers along a row of spines. The paper was cool and slightly rough. She pulled one out, blew dust from the top edge, opened it. The pages were fine. Not damp, not deteriorated. Whatever the town had decided about this building's structural problems, the books had survived the abandonment intact. Someone had built this library to hold books, and the books had been held. She found the founder's plaque near the front entrance, mounted to the wall beside the boarded red door. Bronze, dark with age but legible. Hargrove Public Library, established 1947 by Edmund Hargrove in memory of the city of Caldwell and its people. Below that, a dedication. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge given freely is the only lasting thing. She read it twice, stood with it for a moment. The man who'd paid for this building, who'd put those words on a bronze plaque, she'd seen the name on the exterior and filed it away the way you file away all the names on all the buildings in all the towns you pass through. Now, standing in his library in the early morning with no one else in the building and no one who knew she was there, she found herself wanting to understand who he'd been. She spent the rest of that first day reading. Not novels, the local history shelf near the reference room, which held a modest collection of pamphlets, town council records, and a small press county history that no one had apparently thought worth relocating when the building closed. She sat cross-legged on the floor in a patch of gray light and read for hours, stopping only to flex her fingers when they stiffened. Edmund Hargrove had been born in 1890, the son of a Caldwell hardware merchant. He'd left at 19, gone west, worked in mining, and by 40 had built a company extracting copper and silver across 3 states. He'd never married. No children anyone in the local record could find. He returned to Caldwell in 1944, sold his mining interests, and spent the last 19 years of his life in the town where he'd been born. The library was his primary legacy. He'd funded it entirely, designed it in collaboration with a Pittsburgh architect, donated his personal book collection to stock its shelves. When he died in 1963, at 73, he left the library and its operating endowment to the city of Caldwell in perpetuity. That endowment, she found in a later document, a town council report from 2018, had been exhausted by 2016. Without it, the library ran on general fund allocations the town kept cutting, year by year, until the 2020 closure vote passed 11-3. She set the pamphlets down and looked at the room. A man builds a library, leaves money to keep it running. Town spends the money. Town closes the library. Nobody comes back. Except her. The basics were manageable, barely. Water came from a drinking fountain near the rear of the main floor that, when she tentatively turned its handle on the second morning, produced a sound like old pipes arguing with themselves, then a run of brownish water, then something gradually clearing. She cupped handfuls of it and drank and told herself it was fine, because the alternative was not an option. Food was the harder problem. The $7.43 bought crackers and a jar of peanut butter from the pharmacy on the edge of town, where she paid in coins, kept her eyes down, and left before the woman behind the counter could look too closely. She rationed it across 4 days, counting crackers the way you counted anything you couldn't replace. When she had to leave the library, she moved the way she'd learned to move over 6 years in the system, like someone who belonged wherever she was going. It was a skill that came from necessity. When the house you slept in wasn't yours, when the rules were someone else's to make and change, you learned to walk through a room looking like you had a reason to be there. You made yourself legible as normal. You kept your face neutral. You didn't look at people too long or not long enough. She was good at this. She'd had to be. One afternoon, she sat for an hour on a bench near the town center, watching people. Not out of loneliness, exactly. Out of the noticer's habit, the reflex of attention that had always been how she processed the world. A woman in her 60s carrying grocery bags, walking fast against the cold with a purposefulness that suggested she had somewhere to be and someone waiting. Two men standing outside the hardware store, talking about something with the serious faces of people discussing a problem that didn't have a good solution. A girl about Nora's age walking out of the pharmacy with earbuds in, not looking at anything in particular, looking the way people look when they assume they're not being seen. The girl had a coat that was actually warm. Nora had spent 30 seconds noticing the coat and then made herself stop because some observations led somewhere useful and some just led to cold. Caldwell made it easier than most places. The steel mill 30 miles down the highway had laid off 400 people in October, and the ripple was visible everywhere. Storefronts with paper in their windows. A diner that had fed this town for 40 years shuttered just before Thanksgiving. People weren't looking closely at a 16-year-old walking the sidewalks. People were looking at their own problems. She was grateful for that. She'd always been grateful when invisible was an option. There was a morning in the second week when she woke and lay still in the leather chair for a few minutes before moving, and realized she wasn't dreading the day. That was new. She'd been dreading days for long enough that their absence registered as something noticeable. She didn't have anywhere to go. She didn't have anything she was supposed to be doing, according to any institution or schedule or person who expected something from her. She had a library and a lighter and crackers and whatever she was going to find on the shelves that day. She lay in the chair and listened to the building settling in the early morning cold and felt, not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that existed on the same side of the ledger as okay. By the end of the first week, she had a routine that felt, in its modest way, like a life. She woke when the light changed, drank water from the fountain, and spent the mornings reading. She'd started working through the fiction shelves not alphabetically, but by instinct, pulling spines that appealed to her, and staying with each for an hour or two. A biography of Marie Curie that she read in a single long session, the gray light shifting around her as the morning moved. A collection of letters between two Victorian naturalists that she didn't entirely follow, but couldn't put down something in the precision of their observations. The care they took to describe what they'd seen felt close to a quality she recognized in herself. A history of Caldwell County published in 1932, which she'd picked up thinking it would be dry and found herself absorbed by for most of an afternoon. The county had flooded twice in the 1910s, badly, and the way the book described the aftermath, the town rebuilding with the particular stubbornness of people who had nowhere else to be, had stayed with her. In the afternoons she explored. The library had 3 floors. She spent the first days on the ground level, learning its geography the way you learned any place you might need to navigate in the dark methodically, by repetition, until the layout was stored below conscious thought. The circulation desk with its empty return slot. The card catalog with its hundreds of small drawers, each labeled in that same looping hand. The reference section along the north wall, its shelves holding encyclopedias and indexes, and the kind of reference volumes that existed before the internet made them obsolete. She opened the card catalog one afternoon, just to see, and pulled a random drawer at eye height. GGR. The cards inside were handwritten, each one with a title, an author, a Dewey Decimal number, a brief description in the same looping hand. Someone had written every one of those cards, had held each one and written in careful ink and filed it precisely where it belonged. She ran her thumb along the edges of the cards in the drawer and thought about how long that must have taken. How many hours? How much care? She thought about what it meant to spend that much care on something, and then have the building that held it condemned. She pushed the drawer shut carefully, stood with her hand on the cabinet for a moment, then went back to reading. Was reached by a staircase at the rear of the building, wood, solid, creaking in the middle but holding. Up there she found periodicals and bound volumes spanning several decades, and a small librarian's office with a desk and 2 chairs and filing cabinets and a lamp that was useless without power but still graceful in its design. She opened the filing cabinets and found acquisition records, correspondence with publishers, the administrative bones of a library that someone had run with real care. The head librarian's name, she gathered from the file labels, had been Margaret Olson. She'd served from 1952 until 1991, 39 years, her handwriting appearing on documents across 4 decades. Always the same disciplined hand, evidence of someone who'd made this her life's work and taken that work seriously. The third floor was smaller, lower-ceilinged, given over to oversized volumes and maps and architectural drawings that required flat storage. She spent part of an afternoon looking at old maps of Caldwell, watching the town grow and contract across a century, tracing streets she recognized to streets that no longer existed. The county seat had shifted twice. A railroad line that the 1923 map showed running through the center of town had been removed entirely by 1967. Things changed, even things that seemed permanent. She knew that better than most people her age. But the place she kept returning to was back on the ground floor. The archives room. It sat behind a door at the far end of the reference section, marked archive staff only in the same looping hand as the card catalog drawers. She'd pushed it open on the second day and looked in, but the room had been too dark to read by. On the fourth day, when a patch of winter sun came at exactly the right angle through the uncovered courtyard window and bounced enough diffuse light into the building's interior, she went in properly and spent real time there. The archives room was long and narrow, floor-to-ceiling shelves on both sides. Older than the main floor shelves, not oak, but some darker wood, almost black with age, the grains still visible under decades of dust. The materials here weren't circulating books, but institutional records, board minutes, donation ledgers, correspondence files, the administrative memory of an organization over decades. She spent several hours reading through it, not because she was looking for anything specific, but because she found, in the particular orderliness of old records, a kind of comfort. Someone had maintained these files, had cared about the keeping of them, had believed that the record of what had happened here was worth preserving. The board minutes told a story. The library had been well funded through the 1960s and 1970s, its acquisition budget robust, its programming active. She found references to author talks, summer reading programs, a children's storytelling series that had run for 22 consecutive years. The language of the minutes changed in the 1980s. Words like constraints and allocation and prioritization began appearing with more frequency. By the 1990s, the minutes had a different quality, a guardedness, people being careful with what they put on record while still trying to maintain something. By 2018, the year the endowment ran out, the minutes had the tone of people at the end of a long fight who knew how it was going to end. She set the folder down and sat with that for a moment. She understood that tone. She'd heard it in the voices of adults who were managing situations they couldn't fix, who were trying to protect something they already knew they were going to lose. Then she looked at the far end of the room, where the archive shelves ended and the wall began, and saw the last bookshelf. It stood apart from the archive shelves by about 3 feet. A freestanding unit, roughly 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide, loaded with books that, unlike everything else in the archives room, were not institutional records. They were personal books, the kind of dense, technical volumes that had not been written for general audiences. Her lighter revealed their spines, Principia Mathematica, the complete works of Euclid, 3 volumes on metallurgy published in the 1930s, a treatise on hydrostatic engineering, a collection of monographs on mineral assaying methods, books that belonged to someone's private study, to a man who had spent his life working in mines and then retired to a library and apparently kept his technical library close, in this back room, away from the general collection. On the very bottom shelf, lying flat rather than standing upright, was a leather-bound volume with no title on the spine. She picked it up, opened it. Handwritten. The penmanship was compressed and precise, the kind that suggested someone educated in an era when handwriting was treated as a discipline worth developing. Each letter fully formed, each word considered, the lines running straight across unlined pages without apparent effort. The first entry was dated September 14th, 1951. She didn't read it all at once. She sat on the floor of the archives room with the lighter going in 30-second intervals, reading in bursts, letting her eyes rest in the dark between flicks. The first thing she understood was that the journal belonged to Edmund Hargrove. The handwriting matched the single signed letter she'd found in the local history collection, The one in which he'd written to the town council about the library's founding in a tone that was simultaneously generous and precise, someone who gave freely but also kept careful track of what was given. The early entries were unremarkable. He wrote about the library, about the town, about a drought that had dried up the creek south of Caldwell in the summer of 1951. He wrote about reading, about a letter from an old colleague in Nevada, about the way the light fell through the library windows in December, and reading that, she looked up involuntarily, because the light was falling the same way right now, or nearly the same way, 72 years later, and for a strange moment, she felt the distance between his world and hers compress to almost nothing. He had sat in this room and watched this light. Now she was sitting in this room and watching this light. The building was the same building. Then, in an entry dated November 3rd, 1951, something shifted. The entry was short. The vault is complete. Thompson did good work. I've paid him in full, and we have agreed on silence. It is perhaps eccentric, perhaps more than eccentric, to distrust institutions as completely as I do. But I have seen enough of institutions to know that they fail, always, in the end, in the ways that matter most. The Depression taught me that. The war confirmed it. A man's wealth, if he is careful, can outlast the institutions that would claim it. Mine will. Nora read it 3 times. Then she looked up at the last bookshelf. Then she looked at the wall behind it. She moved the lighter slowly along that back wall. Limestone, same as the exterior of the building, mortar lines running in the pattern you'd expect from a wall built in 1947. Except, about 3 feet to the right of the shelf center, there was a section where the mortar lines didn't quite match. Not dramatically, not even noticeably unless you were looking closely, which she was. The courses of stone ran at a fractionally different angle, like a repair, or like construction done at a different time than the surrounding wall. The color was marginally lighter, too, not dramatically so, but different in the way that things are different when they've been exposed to slightly fewer years of air and dust. She pressed her palm flat against it. Cold, like the rest of the wall. She went back to the journal. Over the following days she read it in pieces, working through Hargrove's careful handwriting with the lighter rationed, building a picture of the man who'd built this building and left it to a town that had eventually locked the doors and walked away. He'd been a complicated person. The library was genuine. She understood that clearly by the 3rd day of reading. His belief in knowledge, in public access to ideas, wasn't decoration or public relations. The words on the bronze plaque were the conclusion of a man who'd spent his life watching things of value disappear and who'd decided that what people learned and retained might be one of the few exceptions. He believed it the way some people believe in things they can point to with evidence rather than faith. He'd built this building with his own money and stocked it with his own books and left it to a city that hadn't asked for it, because he believed it would matter. But the money, the wealth he'd made in the mining years, he didn't trust to anything human. Not banks, not lawyers, not family, because there was no family. He'd watched the Depression hollow out institutions he'd believed were solid in the span of a few months. He'd watched companies he knew to be real and profitable become nothing before he was 50. He'd survived because he'd been in the right position at the right time, and he knew it, and that knowledge had made him careful in ways that other people might have called extreme. The gold was his answer to uncertainty. There was a 1958 entry that she read 4 times. He'd written about a conversation with a man in Caldwell who'd asked him why he'd come back, why a man who'd made a fortune in the West had chosen to return to the small town where he'd been born. Hargrove's recorded response was short. Because the place where you come from is the place you understand. And I wanted to build something I could understand. She sat with that for a while. She'd come from a place too. In the narrow geographic sense, her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in a town she hadn't returned to. She understood that place, or had understood it, once, before understanding it became too painful to carry. The entries from the early 1960s grew shorter. He was aging. He wrote about his health, about the particular indignities of a body that had worked hard and was beginning to communicate that fact. He wrote about the library less, and about what the library meant to him more, the distinction between a building and an idea, between the physical fact of shelves and books and the thing that shelves and books were trying to do. He believed in the thing. He'd always believed in the thing. And he'd built a vault in the basement because he believed that belief required protection. The last entry in the journal was dated March 3rd, 1963. For months before he died. The handwriting was looser, the control less precise. It said, simply, "The library will stand. I have made sure of it. Whatever the town decides, whatever institutions decide, the library will have what it needs. It is behind the last shelf, where it will wait. It has waited before. It can wait as long as it must." Behind the last shelf. She'd stopped breathing when she read it. Then she'd read it again, each one brief and deliberately cautious. He wrote about amounts in a code. She couldn't crack a system of letters and numbers that didn't correspond to any cipher she recognized, careful even in his private writing. But in a November 1955 entry, the word appeared in plain language, the first time he used it directly. "Gold does not require faith. It requires only security, and I have provided security of a permanent kind. The question I must answer is not whether it will hold, but whether anyone will ever have reason to look. I believe they will not. The library will stand as long as libraries stand. And as long as it stands, what is behind it will stand with it. Behind it." She read the sentence again, set the journal carefully on the floor beside her, stood up and walked to the last bookshelf and looked at the wall. Cold limestone. Mortar lines that didn't match. 3 feet to the right of center. She began moving the books from the shelf, stacking them carefully on the floor beside it, keeping them in the order she'd found them. It took 20 minutes. The volumes were heavy metallurgy texts, engineering monographs, the dense physical accumulation of a serious technical library. When the shelf was empty, she put both hands on its side frame and pulled. The shelf moved. Not easily, not gracefully, but it moved, rolling slightly on what she felt with her foot was a track embedded in the floor, old and dust-filled and requiring real force, but a track nonetheless. Someone had designed this to move. Someone had planned for the shelf to be removable, which meant someone had planned for someone to remove it. The shelf rolled 6 inches to the left. Behind it, the wall was different. Not stone. Wood. A panel of dark wood, fitted so precisely against the surrounding limestone that you'd never see it unless you moved the shelf, and no one would move the shelf unless they had a reason, and no one had a reason unless they'd read the journal. And the journal had been sitting flat on the bottom shelf for 70 years, invisible to anyone who didn't reach down and pull that particular spine. She pressed her hand against the wood panel. It didn't give. She worked along the edges, feeling for any gap or handle or mechanism. On the right side, near the bottom, her fingers found a slight depression in the wood. Circular, the diameter of a quarter, smooth at its center. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed harder. Held the pressure for a count of 5. A sound. Very small, somewhere inside the wall. A latch releasing. The panel moved inward 1/2 inch. She pushed it, and it opened. What she saw beyond it was not the vault. The vault was not yet visible. What she saw, in the thin beam of her lighter, was a passage narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, stone-walled, descending by a short flight of stairs into a darkness the lighter couldn't reach. She stood at the entrance for a long time. Her lighter had maybe 30 flicks remaining. She was 16 years old, alone in a condemned building, and had been eating crackers rationed to 11 per day for a week. She had come to this library looking for warmth, had stayed because the books made the cold bearable, had read her way through a dead man's journal in 30-second intervals by lighter flame, had moved a shelf that hadn't moved in decades and pressed a hidden latch and found a passage in the wall of a condemned library in Caldwell, Ohio. She stood at the top of those stairs for a long time. Then she stepped through. The stairs were 8 in total, stone, precisely cut, each one solid under her foot. The walls of the passage were smooth limestone, and as she descended she felt the temperature change slightly, not warmer, but different, denser, the particular quality of underground air that has been sealed from the surface for a very long time. The passage ran about 15 feet before ending at a door. Not wood. Steel, gray and matte, with a wheel-handled mechanism in its center, the kind of door you associated with places where the point was not entry but containment. Around its frame, the limestone had been fitted so that no gap existed between stone and metal. This door had been built to last as long as the institution above it stood, and the institution had stood for 75 years, and here the door was, exactly as it had been left. On the door's face, slightly above the wheel, was a small, engraved plate. 2 lines. E. Hargrove EST 1951. She put her hand on the wheel. Cold steel. She turned it clockwise and felt resistance. Kept turning. The mechanism was old, but not frozen. Someone had built it to tolerances that absorbed decades of disuse. She turned until the resistance changed, until she felt something shift inside the door's locking mechanism. Then she stopped. Because standing at the wheel of a vault door in the basement of a condemned library, alone, at 16, she understood that something had changed in her world. Not just tonight. Not just this discovery. Something larger and harder to name. The logic of her life up to this point had been one of reduction of things being taken, or ending, or proving temporary. Linda Greer's house. Diane's house. The group home. The Perrysburg family that relocated. Her mother's coat on the hook that one Thursday afternoon was simply not on the hook anymore. All of it temporary. All of it taken back. The library was the first place she'd been in years that felt, even in its abandonment, like something that had decided to hold. And behind this door was whatever Edmund Hargrove had trusted to outlast the institutions he didn't believe in. She didn't know yet what it was. She had a lighter with 25 flicks remaining. She was cold and hungry and alone in a basement in December. She stood at the vault door for a long time, her hand on the wheel, and she let herself feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly. Not yet. Something quieter than that. The sense that she was standing somewhere that mattered. That the 47 steps she'd taken through this town, the corner on Melton and 4th, the chain-link fence, the warped board on the ground floor window, none of it had been random. All of it had placed her here. She wasn't ready to open the door tonight. Her lighter was almost gone, and she needed light to see what was inside. She needed to come back with more. That meant a plan, and a plan meant leaving the library and spending her last $7 on something better than crackers, a flashlight, or candles, or both. Something that would let her see in the dark without counting every remaining flick of a lighter that was already running out. She stood at the vault door a moment longer than she needed to. She couldn't have explained why. It wasn't sentimentality. It was something closer to the sensation you got standing at the edge of something large, a lake, a wide field, a view from a high place where the scale of what you were looking at required a moment before you could properly move. She was 16 and alone and had been sleeping in a condemned building for 2 weeks, and she was standing in a stone passage in front of a vault door that had been sealed for 70 years. She needed a moment for that to be real before she turned away from it. Edmund Hargrove had built this vault and climbed down these 8 stairs and stood at this wheel in 1951, the year the Korean War was happening, the year Truman was president, the year that the children Nora's age hadn't been born yet. He'd stood here with something to protect and nowhere better to protect it, and the particular certainty of a man who'd made his own decisions for 60 years and didn't see any reason to start trusting other people's now. He'd turned this wheel. He'd walked back up the stairs. He'd rolled the shelf over the panel and gone back to his library and written it down in his journal in the compressed, careful handwriting of someone who wanted a record. And then 72 years had passed, and the building had stood, and the city had managed the endowment badly, and then run out of it, and the council had voted 11-3, and the boards had gone up, and the fence had gone up, and the yellow sign had gone up, and the building had sat in the December cold for 3 years until a 16-year-old girl with a warped board and a dying lighter had found her way inside. He'd been right about the library standing. He'd just been wrong about why. She released the wheel, turned, went back up the stairs, pulled the panel shut behind her, rolled the shelf back into place and restacked the books in exactly the order she'd found them, because she didn't know yet who might come, and precision was free. She went back to the leather chair and sat down and opened Jane Eyre and read by the fading light of the December afternoon until she couldn't see the words anymore. Then she sat in the dark and thought about Edmund Hargrove, who'd distrusted institutions and built a library to prove that some things could last, who'd written in his journal that what was behind it would stand as long as the library stood. The library was still standing. She was inside it. And tomorrow she was going back through that door. Outside, the wind moved against the limestone walls in long, slow passes, the sound of the building absorbing the cold the way it had been absorbing cold for 75 years. Inside, the books breathed in the dark. The card catalog drawers stayed shut. The brass ladder tracks ran the length of the shelves and went nowhere in particular. Nora Voss slept. She did not know yet what was waiting behind that door. She did not know what Edmund Hargrove had spent 30 years accumulating, or how much it weighed, or what it was worth in any currency that applied to a 16-year-old sleeping in a condemned library with 25 lighter flicks and $7, and a paperback she'd been carrying across 4 placements and 3 towns. She did not know what was waiting, but she had found the door, and she had turned the wheel. And the mechanism inside had shifted because someone 70 years ago had built it to function regardless of time for the person who would eventually need it to function. Because Hargrove had been careful. Because he'd thought about the future the way careful people think about futures, not with certainty, not with a specific name or face in mind, but with the conviction that if you built something to hold, it would hold. That whoever came would find it. That the library would stand long enough for the finding to happen. He'd built it for a person he'd never meet, in a time he couldn't imagine, with a problem he could only guess at. Nora had found it. The snow outside the chain-link fence lay quiet and frozen on the courtyard, unmarked except for the small prints where she'd crossed it 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday night in December. The prints were already half filled with new snow. Nobody knew they were there. She bought the flashlight the next morning. $7 was what she had left, and the flashlight at the pharmacy cost $6.49, which left her 51 cents and no food. She stood in the aisle for long enough that the woman at the counter glanced over twice, which was once more than Nora wanted. A mother and 2 young children came into the pharmacy while she was standing there, the kids running ahead of their mother toward the candy section, and the mother calling after them in a voice that was tired but not angry, the particular tiredness of someone who loved something demanding. Nora watched them for a moment. Then she put the flashlight on the counter, paid in coins, and left before anything required explanation. Outside, the cold was the same cold it had been for 2 weeks, the kind that didn't get worse or better, just maintained itself with the patience of something that had been doing this for months and was prepared to continue indefinitely. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked back toward Hargrove Avenue. Not directly, not in a straight line that someone watching from any of the windows she passed might connect to a destination, but in the wandering pattern of someone with no particular place to be. She'd bought herself a flashlight. That was what she had now. 51 cents and a flashlight, and the knowledge that behind the last bookshelf in a condemned library, down 8 stone steps, at the end of a 15-foot passage, was a vault door that hadn't been opened since 1963. She went back through the warped board, through the storage room, through the door to the main floor, and stood for a moment in the reading room the way she'd started doing each morning, taking inventory. The books still in their places. The card catalog still shut. The brass ladder tracks still running the length of the shelves to nowhere in particular. Everything the same. She walked to the archives room, to the last bookshelf, moved the books to the floor with more efficiency now than the first time she had the sequence memorized. Each volume returned to its exact position, the whole operation running on a kind of muscle memory that had developed in less than a week. She pulled the shelf, found the panel, pressed the depression at the bottom right corner, and felt the latch release. Pushed the panel open, went down the 8 stairs, stood at the vault door, turned the wheel. The mechanism was the same as the day before, resistant, but not seized, the internal components moving with the deliberate precision of engineering that had been designed to function regardless of what time chose to do. She turned until she felt the shift, the internal alignment of whatever system Hargrove and the man called Thompson had built in 1951, and then she stopped turning and pulled. The door opened. Not easily. The hinges moved slowly, the weight of the door considerable, the seal between frame and edge breaking with a sound that wasn't quite a crack and wasn't quite a sigh, something in between, the sound of a closed thing becoming open. The air that came out was not cold. It was different. Still, the air of a room that had been sealed completely for 6 decades and had therefore developed, in its stillness, a quality that had no equivalent in the outside world. She raised the flashlight. The beam entered the vault, and Nora Voss saw what Edmund Hargrove had left behind. The room was larger than the passage had suggested, roughly 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, carved out of the bedrock beneath the library's foundation. The walls were smooth limestone, the same as the passage, with the same precision of finish someone who cared had done this work, someone who understood that a room built to last had to be built right. The floor was level, slightly rough for traction. The ceiling was 8 feet, high enough to stand comfortably, to move without crouching. The shelves were steel, floor-to-ceiling steel shelving units, 4 of them, running parallel along the room's length on both sides, with a central aisle between them wide enough for 2 people to pass. On the shelves, stacked in rows with the orderliness of someone who had spent a lifetime managing inventory in large-scale industrial operations, were bars. Gold bars. She stood in the doorway and moved the flashlight beam slowly across the room, left to right, shelf by shelf, and her mind was very quiet in the way that minds go quiet when the information arriving exceeds what they can process in real time. The bars were not identical in size. Some were the large industrial type she recognized vaguely from images, others smaller, more varied in dimension, as though accumulated from different sources over different periods, gathered across 30 years through channels that a careful and private man could keep private. All of them had the dull, warm luster that she associated with gold from photographs and textbooks, a color that wasn't yellow exactly, but something more complex and more serious. Something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Something that looked, in the beam of her flashlight, like solid patience. Like something that had decided long ago it wasn't going anywhere. She counted the shelves. For units, each with 7 levels, each level filled. She walked into the room. The silence was total. No building sounds penetrated here. No wind. No structural settling. No distant traffic. The vault was below the stone foundation, and the stone foundation was below the library, and the library was surrounded by winter and fence and abandoned courtyard. But none of that reached this room. This room existed in a kind of absolute stillness that she had never experienced before, not in any of the empty houses or vacant rooms or institutional spaces she'd passed through. This was the quiet of something that had been removed from the world's noise by design and by 60 years of being left alone. She touched one of the bars with her fingertips. It was cold, heavier than she expected, even holding just the edge of it. She could tell the weight of it through the shelf, the way the steel unit settled differently under this load than shelving loaded with lighter materials. She picked one up with both hands, smaller than the largest ones, rectangular and solid, and held it. The weight was specific and unexpected, the particular density of a metal that was twice as heavy as steel by volume, that had been treated since antiquity as though its weight were itself a kind of proof. She held it for a long moment, and then put it back carefully, exactly where it had been. She looked at the rows, the organized columns of bars stacked with a miner's precision. She tried to count them and lost track and started again. Hundreds. The number she arrived at was somewhere between 500 and 700, varying by the size of the individual bars. She stopped counting after 2 attempts and just stood in the center of the aisle and let the reality of it settle over her the way the vault's air settled over everything, slowly, thoroughly, with patience. This was real. This was here. This had been here since 1951, while the library above it was built and run and loved and caught and eventually condemned. While 22 years of a children's storytelling series happened. While Margaret Olson filed her acquisition records for 39 years. While the board minutes changed their language decade by decade. While the endowment ran out. While the vote was 11-3. The gold had not voted. The gold had just waited. On the wall near the door, at eye height, was a document in a glass-fronted frame. The frame was dusty, but behind the glass the document was legible. She moved the flashlight to it and read. It was a letter, dated July 12, 1963. Edmund Hargrove's handwriting, looser than the journal entries she'd read, but recognizable. The same compressed script trying to hold its form against the deterioration of a man who was ill and knew it. To whoever has come here, it began. No greeting, no name, just that. The gold in this vault was accumulated between the years 1933 and 1963, in varying quantities, from varying sources. All of it was legally obtained. All of it has been declared to no taxing authority, which is a matter I made my peace with long ago, and which I leave to whoever reads this to make their own peace with. I did not trust banks. I did not trust the systems that managed other men's money, having watched those systems fail entirely in 1929 and partially again in 1938. I trusted stone and steel and my own judgment, and I was not wrong to trust them. The total weight of gold stored here is approximately 6,800 troy pounds. The rare coins in the lower drawers have additional numismatic value beyond their gold content. I have not been able to arrange for these to be appraised in a manner that preserved my privacy, but I was assured in 1961 by a dealer in Cincinnati who did not know whose collection he was examining that the coin holdings alone exceeded, at that time's prices, a considerable sum. I have no heirs. I have no family who survives me. I have the library, which I have left to the city. I would like the gold to go to the library as well, but I do not know how to arrange this in a manner that will not result in it being seized by the state or distributed in ways I cannot predict. So I am leaving it here. I am leaving it in the hope that whoever finds it, and someone will find it, because things do not stay hidden forever, will understand what it was for, and will make a decision I would have been proud of. I built this library because I believe that knowledge given freely is the only lasting thing. I hope whoever reads this letter knows, by now, whether or not I was right. E. Hargrove, July 1963. She read it twice. Stood with the flashlight on the glass for a long time. Then she looked around the room again, at the shelves, at the bars, at the drawers along the lower section of one-unit flat file drawers, the kind used for documents or, as Hargrove had written, coins. She pulled one open. Inside were trays. Velvet-lined trays, each one holding coins in individual depressions, each coin in a small glassine envelope labeled in handwriting she recognized. She picked one up and held the flashlight close. A double eagle. 1933. American gold coin, $20 denomination, with the image of Liberty walking on one face and an eagle on the other. She knew this coin vaguely from something she'd read, the information surfacing now from the particular kind of memory she had for things she'd encountered in print or reference somewhere, in a history of American monetary policy or a biography of Roosevelt, the complicated story of the 1933 recall, the melting of nearly all of them. The ones that hadn't been melted were, in any language you chose to apply to them, extraordinary. She put it back, opened another drawer. More trays, more coins, different years, different denominations, all labeled in Hargrove's hand with dates and what appeared to be acquisition notes. The collection was systematic, the work of a man who'd spent 30 years cultivating it with the same care he'd spent cultivating the library above. A person who distrusted institutions had still kept meticulous records for himself. Because the records were his. Because he trusted himself. Because the distinction between what you gave to others and what you held for yourself was, for Hargrove, a matter of principle he'd thought about carefully. She set the drawer back in its housing and stood in the center of the vault's aisle and looked at both sides of the room at once, the bars and the drawers and the letter on the wall, and let herself feel the full weight of what she was standing in. She'd been sleeping upstairs in a leather chair for 2 weeks. She'd been eating crackers 11 at a time. She'd been managing the specific arithmetic of survival in ways that had consumed most of her available attention. And beneath the floor she'd been sleeping on, behind a shelf of technical volumes, down 8 stairs past a hidden panel, inside a vault sealed for 70 years, was this. The flashlight, propped against the bottom shelf, lit the room in a fixed angle, casting the bars into relief and throwing long shadows across the floor. She sat in the middle of those shadows and tried to think clearly, because she was a person who thought clearly when it mattered, and this mattered more than anything had ever mattered. She was a 16-year-old girl who was technically homeless, technically without legal standing in any of the categories that would matter if she walked up to someone and said what she had found. She had no parents, no guardian, no address, no phone. She had 51 cents and a flashlight she'd bought an hour ago, and a worn copy of Jane Eyre in a leather chair upstairs. She was sitting on the floor of a vault that held, by the dead man's own accounting, approximately 6,800 troy pounds of gold. She did the math in her head, slowly, because she wasn't certain of her figures. A troy pound was 12 troy ounces. 6,800 troy pounds was approximately 81,600 troy ounces. At whatever gold was worth now, she didn't know exactly. Hadn't had reason to track commodity prices, but she'd seen a number once in an economics context, something in the range of several $1,000s per ounce in recent years. The math produced a number that seemed impossible. It was not impossible. She knew it wasn't impossible. The number was simply very large. Very large was not the same as impossible. She'd read about fortunes before, in biographies and histories, and the amounts in those books were very large too, and those amounts were real. She sat in the vault and breathed the still air and looked at the shelves and thought about Edmund Hargrove, who'd come back to the town where he was born and built a library and put these words on a bronze plaque. Knowledge given freely is the only lasting thing. And then gone down 8 stairs to a room below the library, and spent 30 years arranging gold bars on steel shelves, because he didn't trust the things he couldn't hold. He had trusted the building to hold what he couldn't control. He had trusted time to deliver whatever he'd left to the person who was supposed to have it. She thought about his letter again. I hope whoever reads this letter knows, by now, whether or not I was right. She thought. He was right. She'd been educated, in every meaningful sense, by the things she'd read. The books had given her something that none of the institutions had managed to provide, a way of thinking about her situation that was larger than her situation. A sense that difficult circumstances were survivable. Jane Eyre had not had a good beginning either, and Jane Eyre had known her own worth even when no one around her confirmed it. She was in the vault for a long time. She didn't count the minutes. When she finally stood up and walked back out through the door and pulled it shut behind her and climbed the 8 stairs and replaced the panel and rolled the shelf back and restacked the books in their order, it was because she needed to think somewhere other than a vault, in air that moved, in light that came from something other than a flashlight beam. She went back to the leather chair. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She sat for the rest of that afternoon without reading. Jane Eyre stayed closed in her lap. She thought about what she knew, which was limited but specific. The vault existed. The gold was real. Hargrove had declared it to no taxing authority, which created a legal complication she was not equipped to evaluate alone. He had no heirs. He had left it to whoever found it, with a letter expressing a specific hope about the decision they'd make. The library had been left to the city, which had spent the endowment and condemned the building. The building was condemned, but standing. She was inside it. She thought about what she didn't know, which was enormous. She didn't know who had legal claim to property found in a condemned building. She didn't know what happened when a minor without a legal guardian found valuables, whether the state would step in, whether a guardian ad litem would be appointed, whether anything she said or did before a lawyer was present could be used against her in whatever proceedings followed. She didn't know if Hargrove's estate had ever been formally settled or if the vault had simply been overlooked because no one knew to look. She knew she needed help. That was the clearest thing in all of it. She needed help from someone who understood things she didn't and who would not immediately, on learning her situation, become an instrument of the systems that had been managing her life for 6 years. She needed someone who would listen before they acted, who would sit across from her and hear what she had to say and treat the information she was giving them as belonging to her, not as a problem to be managed. She didn't know who that person was yet. What she did know was that the vault would not go anywhere. The gold had been in that room since 1951. It would still be there tomorrow. It would still be there next week. She had time to think, and thinking carefully now seemed considerably more important than acting quickly and getting it wrong. Getting it wrong had consequences she could almost see clearly, like a future she could lose before she'd had a chance to build it. She sat with that logic and let it steady her. Outside, the December light faded early. 4:30 and the sky was already the deep gray of a day ending. The library settled around her in the dusk, the particular sounds of stone and timber at temperature change, not alarming, familiar by now. She'd learned to hear the difference between a building's sound and a person's sound. She'd learned this the way she'd learned most things, out of necessity, through attention. She fell asleep in the chair. She woke to footsteps. Not inside the building. Outside. The particular sound of feet on the frozen courtyard, crunching slightly with each step in the way that ice-covered snow crunched when weighted. She came fully awake immediately, the way she'd learned to wake in places where a sound outside the normal register required full attention fast. She sat still, listening. The footsteps moved along the building's exterior. Slow, methodical. Not the careless pace of someone cutting through the alley. The pace of someone examining. She could track the sound moving along the north wall, pausing, then continuing, moving around to the rear of the building. She got out of the chair without sound and moved to the courtyard-facing window, staying below the sill, and raised herself slowly until she could see through the lower edge of the glass. A man, 50s, maybe, in a heavy coat and a knitted cap, holding a flashlight of his own. He was standing at the rear of the building looking at the ground, looking at something specific. She followed his gaze and understood what he was seeing. Her footprints. Not just from tonight. 2 weeks of going in and out through the warped board had left a record in the snow of the alley, in the frost of the courtyard. The snow had fallen and refilled some of them, but not all. There were older prints, newer prints, a pattern of activity that was visible to anyone who looked closely enough. She'd been careless. She'd been focused on the vault, on the journal, on the crackers in the water and the routine of staying alive in a building with no heat, and she'd stopped thinking about the evidence she was leaving behind. The man moved to the rear window. She could see him examining the board, the gap at its bottom, the way the board was not fully attached. He touched it the same way she'd touched it on the first night, testing the GIF. He spent a moment with it, then stepped back and swept his flashlight across the building's rear face, checking the other windows. She dropped below the sill and didn't breathe. She counted seconds. 20, 30, 50. She heard him moving again back along the building, around the corner, across the courtyard toward the fence. The gate rattled slightly, then the sound of it closing. Then nothing. She waited another 10 minutes before moving. Not a guess, she counted it, second by second, because 10 minutes was enough time for someone to walk away and then pause and come back to look again, and she was not going to miscalculate now. When she finally got up, she went directly to the storage room and looked at the board from the inside. She could fix it. There was a utility shelf in the storage room with a few old tools, a hammer, some nails, odds and ends of maintenance material left behind when the building was closed. She could nail the board back to the frame from the inside, which would eliminate the entry point, but would also seal her in. She could leave it as it was and hope the man didn't return with someone official. She could find another entry and seal this one. She also understood something else. The man had come once. He would come back with different tools, a camera, a colleague, possibly someone with authority. She had, at most, a few days before the situation at the library became a situation that involved other people who would have different ideas about what happened next. The timeline she'd been giving herself, indefinite, comfortable, she'd figure it out when she was ready, had just collapsed to something much shorter. She didn't panic. Panic was expensive, and she didn't have the budget for it. She went to the maintenance access panel in the east basement wall, confirmed it still opened cleanly, confirmed the passage to the exterior was clear. She had an exit that nobody knew about. Then she went back upstairs, nailed the board, and sat in the leather chair, and made herself think through the sequence of what had to happen and in what order. The next step was information. She needed to understand the legal situation before she could do anything else. She needed to know about estates, about unclaimed property, about what happened to assets discovered in a condemned building, about how a minor without a guardian could navigate a system designed to operate through adults. She needed a library. The irony of that thought arrived slowly, and then all at once. She was in a library. The Hargrove Public Library had 3 floors of books, a reference section, and a periodicals archive, and it didn't have internet. But it had the Revised Code of Ohio 1998, which was sitting on the reference shelf and which contained, she was fairly certain, the foundational statutes on unclaimed property and estates. She went to the reference section, found the legal volumes, pulled the Ohio Revised Code, and carried it to the leather chair. She read for 3 hours, with the flashlight she'd bought that morning, moving methodically through the sections on estates, on abandoned property, on unclaimed assets. The language was dense and circular in the way legal language was always dense and circular, built to be precise, but producing a kind of comprehension that required rereading the same sentence 4 times before it resolved. She pushed through it. She was good at this. She'd been pushing through dense text since she was 11. Since that first week with Jane Eyre, when the Victorian syntax had felt like a foreign language that gradually became her own. What she found, after 3 hours, was this. Ohio's unclaimed property statutes applied to financial assets held by institutions' bank accounts, insurance policies, securities that had been dormant past a specified period. They did not clearly address physical assets concealed in a building and unknown to anyone. The estate statutes governed the distribution of property after death, but only if the estate had been formally opened and managed. If Hargrove's estate had been settled in 1963, the distribution would have occurred then, under the terms of his documented will, which had left the library and its endowment to the city. The vault was not in the documented will because no one who prepared the will had known it existed, which meant it had never been distributed, which meant it existed in a legal gap, not unclaimed in the statutory sense, not actively managed, not formally part of any estate. It was simply there, in a place no one knew to look, in a building that had since been condemned. She didn't know what that meant for her specifically. She knew it meant the situation was more complex than she could resolve alone, which she'd already understood. But the complexity now had a shape she could reason about, instead of just a weight she couldn't see. What she needed was an adult who would be on her side. Not the system's side. Not the city's side. Not whatever agency would be contacted the moment a miner was found living in a condemned building full of gold. Hers. She thought about the people she'd known in the past 6 years. Diane, who'd genuinely tried, but who'd also followed the system's logic when it came to placement decisions. Linda Greer, who was a professional in every sense and had treated the expiration of a placement as a parking meter. Mr. Patrice, who saw categories. None of them were people she'd trust with this. There was a woman named Barbara who'd been a house parent at the group home in Westfield, a small woman with gray hair and a direct way of speaking who'd told Nora once, without sentimentality, that the system was not designed for her, and she should know that and plan accordingly. Not cruel practical. Barbara had given her the specific kind of advice that came from someone who had seen enough of a situation to know that pretending it was better than it was served no one. She didn't know where Barbara was now. The group home had closed. She didn't have a number. She thought about this problem for a long time, the flashlight balanced on the chair's arm, the Ohio Revised Code open in her lap, to a section on intestate succession that she'd been reading without retaining anything, and realized that what she was really thinking about was trust. Who did she trust? Who, in the history of her 16 years, had she trusted with something important? She trusted Jane Eyre. She trusted the pages of books to hold what they were supposed to hold and to give it back when she needed it. She trusted the library around her, which had held its books for 3 years of abandonment and would hold them for more. She trusted Edmund Hargrove's engineering, which had sealed a vault in 1951 and kept it sealed until this week. She didn't, at this particular moment, trust many people. But she understood something that hadn't been fully clear before. She couldn't do this alone. Not because she lacked the intelligence or the determination, but because the systems that governed what happened next, the legal systems, the estate systems, the systems that would decide what happened to the gold and to her and to the library, those systems required an advocate. Someone with standing. Someone who could walk into a room and be taken seriously without having to explain first why they deserved to be taken seriously. She needed to find that person, and she needed to find them before the man with the flashlight came back with someone who had a badge. The timeline she'd been giving herself had just collapsed to something much shorter. The irony of that thought arrived slowly and then all at once. She was in a library. The Hargrove Public Library had 3 floors of books, a reference section, a periodicals archive, and 15 years of legal reference volumes in a section she hadn't spent enough time in yet. It didn't have internet. It didn't have current information, but it had the Revised Code of Ohio 1998, which was sitting on the reference shelf and which contained, she was fairly certain, the foundational statutes on unclaimed property and estates. She went to the reference section, found the legal volumes, pulled the Ohio Revised Code, and carried it to the leather chair. She read for 3 hours, with the flashlight she'd bought that morning, moving methodically through the sections on estates, on abandoned property, on unclaimed assets. The language was dense and circular in the way legal language was always dense and circular, built to be precise, but producing a kind of comprehension that required rereading the same sentence 4 times before it resolved. She pushed through it. What she found, after 3 hours, was this. Ohio's unclaimed property statutes applied to financial assets held by institutions' bank accounts, insurance policies, securities that had been dormant past a specified period. They did not clearly address physical assets concealed in a building and unknown to anyone. The estate statutes governed the distribution of property after death, but only if the estate had been formally opened. If Hargrove's estate had been settled in 1963, the distribution would have occurred then, under the terms of his documented will, which had left the library and its endowment to the city. The vault was not in the documented will because no one who prepared the will had known it existed, which meant it had never been distributed, which meant it existed in a legal gap, not unclaimed in the statutory sense, not actively managed, not formally part of any estate that had been closed. It was simply there, in a place no one knew to look, in a building that had since been condemned. She didn't know what that meant for her specifically. She knew it meant the situation was more complex than she could resolve alone, which she'd already understood. But the complexity now had a shape she could reason about, instead of just a weight she couldn't see. What she needed was an adult who would be on her side. Not the system's side. Not the city's side. Not whatever agency would be contacted the moment a miner was found living in a condemned building full of gold. Hers. She thought about the people she'd known in the past 6 years. Diane, who'd genuinely tried, but who'd also followed the system's logic when it came to placement decisions. Linda Greer, who was a professional in every sense and had treated the expiration of a placement as straightforwardly as a parking meter. Mr. Patrice, who saw categories. The woman at the Greyhound station who'd watched her too carefully. None of them were people she'd trust with this. There was a woman named Barbara who'd been a house parent at the group home in Westfield, a small woman with gray hair and a direct way of speaking who'd told Nora once, without sentimentality, that the system was not designed for her, and she should know that and plan accordingly. Not cruel practical. Barbara had given her the specific kind of advice that came from someone who had seen enough of a situation to know that pretending it was better than it was served no one. She didn't know where Barbara was now. The group home had closed. She didn't have a number. She thought about this problem for a long time, the flashlight balanced on the chair's arm, the Ohio Revised Code open in her lap, to a section on intestate succession that she'd been reading without retaining anything, and realized that what she was really thinking about was trust. Who did she trust? Who, in the history of her 16 years, had she trusted with something important? She trusted Jane Eyre. She trusted the pages of books to hold what they were supposed to hold and to give it back when she needed it. She trusted the library around her, which had held its books for 3 years of abandonment and would hold them for more. She trusted Edmund Hargrove's engineering, which had sealed a vault in 1951 and kept it sealed until this week. She didn't, at this particular moment, trust many people. But she understood something that hadn't been fully clear before. She couldn't do this alone. Not because she lacked the intelligence or the determination, but because the systems that governed what happened next, the legal systems, the estate systems, the systems that would decide what happened to the gold and to her, and to the library, those systems required an advocate. Someone with standing. Someone who could walk into a room and be taken seriously without having to explain first why they deserved to be taken seriously. She needed to find that person, and she needed to find them before the man with the flashlight came back with someone who had a badge. The timeline she'd been giving herself had just collapsed to something much shorter. She spent the next 2 days thinking about it. She read more. She ate less. The crackers were nearly gone, and she had 51 cents to replace them with. She went to the vault once each day, not to take anything, not to move anything, just to confirm that it was still there and still sealed, and that she hadn't invented it. This sounds strange, maybe, that she needed to confirm it. But there was something about the gap between the vault and the leather chair, between the steel door and the tin panel ceiling of the reading room, that made the vault feel like it belonged to a different register of reality, like something she might have dreamed in the cold. Each time she opened the vault door and moved the beam of her flashlight across the shelves, the same thing happened. The bars were there, stacked with the same precision they'd been stacked with in 1951. The drawers of coins were there, each tray in its place, each envelope labeled. The letter in its glass frame was there, the handwriting as legible as it had been the first time she'd read it. Hargrove's voice, compressed and precise, coming through from 1963. It was real. It was very real. And it was waiting with the patience of something that had already waited 70 years and understood that time was not the obstacle. She understood something else during those 2 days of sitting and thinking and reading. She understood that the reason Hargrove had no heirs wasn't simply a biographical fact about his life. It was a choice that had been made over a lifetime, consciously or not. And the result of that choice was that the thing he'd built and the thing he'd hidden were both, in a meaningful sense, looking for someone. The library had been looking for someone to care for it. The vault had been looking for someone to make the decision he'd asked for. She was 16 years old, and she had been looking for somewhere that needed her without requiring her to first be something she wasn't. Maybe that was what Hargrove had meant by whoever. Maybe he'd understood, in the oblique way that dying people sometimes understood things they couldn't fully articulate, that the right person would be someone who needed the finding as much as what was found needed finding. On the 3rd day after finding the vault, She left the library through the east basement passage and walked to the public library branch 3 miles away and opened one, a functioning one, with heat and fluorescent light, and a librarian at the desk who glanced at her and then looked back at her computer screen. She sat at a terminal for the first time in weeks, feeling the strange luxury of warmth that came from a building maintained by people who thought warmth was a reasonable thing to provide. She searched for two things. First, gold price, current. The number that appeared on the screen was $2,241 per troy ounce. She did the math slowly, with the specific figures now in front of her. 6,800 troy pounds, as Hargrove had written. 12 troy ounces per troy pound. 81,600 troy ounces. Multiplied by 2,241. The number produced was larger than she'd calculated before. Much larger. She checked the arithmetic twice, using the scratch paper she'd brought. Then she sat looking at it. And that was without the coins. She searched the 1933 Double Eagle separately. Found it referenced in auction records, in numismatic databases, in news articles about rare American gold coins that had been controversial since the Roosevelt administration ordered the gold standard abandoned, and most of those coins were recalled and melted. The ones that survived the recall were, in the language of the auction records, among the most valuable coins in the world. A single 1933 Double Eagle had sold at auction in 2021 for $18.8 million. She looked up from the screen. There had been multiple examples in that first drawer she'd opened. Multiple glassine envelopes, each labeled in Hargrove's careful hand. She looked back at the screen for a moment and then closed the browser window, because the number she'd arrived at was the kind of number that required sitting with rather than continuing to add to. The total value of what was in that basement vault in gold alone, at current prices, before the coins was somewhere in the range of $450 to $500 million. She sat at the terminal for a moment, not searching anything, just sitting in the warmth of a functioning building with other people in it, and felt the particular weight of knowing something that no one else in the world knew. Edmund Hargrove had known. The man called Thompson, who'd built the vault in 1951 and been paid in full and agreed to silence, had known. For the past 60 years, no one had known. Now she knew. Second search, Legal Aid Ohio, minor, property discovery. She found 3 organizations. Wrote down the numbers on a scrap of paper. Wrote down their addresses too, because she didn't know which method of contact would be more useful, and she wasn't going to leave anything to chance that she didn't have to leave to chance. She left the public library branch and walked back toward the Hargrove Library through the December afternoon, and the cold was the same cold it always was. She had one more decision to make before she contacted anyone. It had been sitting at the edge of her thinking for 3 days, since the night she'd first read the letter in its glass frame. The library. Hargrove had left everything he cared about to this building. He'd funded it, stocked it, provided for its perpetual operation. The city had spent the endowment and condemned the building. The gold in the basement vault was approximately $460 million, at current prices, by her best calculation. The library's roof was intact. The walls were solid limestone. The books were in their places. All of it needed was maintenance and resources and someone to open the door. She thought about what it would mean. Not for her. Not yet. That was a problem for a slightly later version of herself who had a lawyer and legal standing and a future she could actually see. For the library itself. For the town that had voted 11-3 and then watched a diner close and a mill lay off 400 people, and the list of things not worth maintaining keep getting longer. She thought about the 22 years of a children's storytelling series. She thought about Margaret Olson's handwriting, consistent across 4 decades, the looping script that had labeled every card in the card catalog and every file in the records room with the same care, the care of someone who believed that this work was worth doing well. She thought about what it would mean for a building to come back. Not just to reopen, but to come back to have its doors unlocked and its windows unboarded and the brass ladder tracks freed to roll again, and children in the low-shelved section reaching for the books that had been waiting at exactly the right height for 3 years. The thought of a child reaching for a book that had been waiting for them produced something in her chest that she couldn't name exactly, but that felt like the opposite of the hook with no code on it. She thought about Hargrove's letter. I hope whoever reads this letter knows, by now, whether or not I was right. She thought she knew. She thought, yes, knowledge given freely is the only lasting thing. She'd been raised, in every house she'd been placed in, by the things she read. The books had given her something that none of the institutions had managed to give, not the system, not the placements, not the printed sheets with waiting list phone numbers. The books had given her a way of thinking about her situation that was larger than her situation, a sense that difficult circumstances were survivable and even, in their own difficult way, instructive. Jane Eyre had not had a good beginning either. She went back through the east basement passage and climbed to the main floor and sat in the leather chair and opened Jane Eyre to the page she'd marked. "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me," she read. "I am a free human being with an independent will." She read it again. Then she put the book down and picked up the scrap of paper with the 3 phone numbers and folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of her backpack, next to the resources for young adults in transition sheet that Mr. Patrice had given her. Paper that mattered, even paper that hurt. Paper was proof that something had happened. Tomorrow she would make a call. She would find someone to trust, or she would find out if there was anyone left worth finding. She would tell them what she'd found, and she would watch how they listened, and she would decide based on how they listened whether they were the right person. Not the most qualified person, not the most powerful person. The right person, the one who would sit across from a 16-year-old girl and hear what she was saying before they started thinking about what to do about it. She thought about what she was going to say, how you began a conversation like this, how you walked into a room carrying something that didn't fit in a room and tried to make it fit using only words. She'd been doing that her whole life, in different ways, carrying things that didn't fit in rooms into rooms and finding a way to set them down without them breaking. She was good at it. She hadn't always known she was good at it, but she was. She thought about Hargrove one last time before she let herself sleep. About the man who'd come back. About the building he'd built. About the 30 years of quiet accumulation in the basement below, bar by bar, drawer by drawer, labeled in his careful script. About the letter in its glass frame. I hope whoever reads this knows, by now, whether or not I was right. She knew. Tonight she sat in the chair and read Jane Eyre in the beam of her flashlight and listened to the building settle around her. And the gold sat in the vault below the floor and waited with the patience of things that had been waiting for a very long time. Outside, the fence stood. The yellow sign said condemned. The chain was on the gate. The snow lay in the courtyard, catching the pale light of a winter sky with no stars visible behind its cover. The man with the flashlight didn't come back that night, but she knew he would. And she knew that when he did, she needed to be ready. Not to run. She was done running. She'd been running, in the various ways that 16-year-olds ran without going anywhere, since she was 8 years old, through placements and new schools and new sets of rules, and the particular motion of a life that kept moving without arriving. She was done. She needed to be ready to stand in a room, with a lawyer beside her and a letter in a glass frame in her hand, and tell whoever came exactly what Edmund Hargrove had left, exactly where it was, and exactly what she thought should be done with it. She had a view about what should be done with it. She had a view about the library and the town and what a building with solid limestone walls and intact books deserved, which was the opposite of a yellow sign and a chain. She had always been worth the trouble. She had always been someone whose case was worth making. Tomorrow she would start making it. She thought about what Hargrove would say, if he could say anything. If 70 years after walking up those 8 stairs for the last time, he could somehow see who had come down them. She didn't think he'd be surprised by the circumstances. The man who'd written Whoever Has Come Here had imagined a wide range of possibilities. What she thought he'd recognize was the attention, the care she'd taken with his journal, the way she'd res-tacked his books in order, the way she'd pressed her palm against the different section of wall and understood what she was feeling before she could explain why. He'd been a noticer too. She could tell that from every entry she'd read, the way he observed and recorded and kept careful track, not because anyone required it, but because he thought the records mattered. The records mattered. She was part of the record now. She'd come down the stairs. She'd turned the wheel. She'd read the letter. Whatever happened next, and something was going to happen next, something with lawyers and the state of Ohio, and whatever category of law applied to a vault full of gold discovered by a miner in a condemned library, whatever it was, she was in it. She'd pushed through the board. She'd climbed the stairs. She'd pressed the latch. She was done with the part of this where she was invisible. Tonight, she turned a page. The library held still around her, and the vault beneath held its gold. And somewhere in the dark of the December sky above Caldwell, Ohio. The clouds shifted, and for a few minutes the stars were visible through the courtyard window, sharp and cold, and entirely indifferent to the particular fact of one girl reading in the wreck of a place that someone had decided wasn't worth the trouble. She was worth the trouble. She had always been worth the trouble. She just hadn't had anyone to make the case before. But the case was already being built. In the careful handwriting of a dead man's letter. In the pages of a book she'd been carrying since she was 11. In the mind of a girl who paid attention and remembered everything she'd ever read and who understood, now, that what was behind the last bookshelf was not just gold. It was proof that some things held, that some things waited, that whoever came, whatever their circumstances, whatever their age, could find what had been left for them, if they pushed through the warped board and climbed the 8 stairs and turned the wheel. Tomorrow was coming. She was ready. She made the call on a Wednesday morning from the payphone outside the pharmacy on the edge of town. She'd kept 51 cents and spent 15 on the call. She didn't know if 15 cents was enough for a payphone in the current decade. She wasn't entirely sure when payphones had last been a thing people thought about, but the phone worked, and it took the coin, and it rang. She had the scrap of paper in her hand, the 3 numbers she'd written down at the public library branch, her own handwriting in ballpoint pen on the back of a receipt. She'd practiced what she was going to say, not in writing but in her mind, lying in the hotel room at night working out the sequence. Who she was, what she'd found, what she needed, why she was calling this number and not a different kind of number. She'd rehearsed it until it was clean and clear and couldn't be misunderstood. The first organization on the list rang through to a voicemail that said they were experiencing high call volumes. She hung up before the beep. The second rang twice, and a woman answered. Caldwell Legal Aid. This is Ruth. Not the organization's full name. Not a last name. Just Ruth. Nora registered that immediately, the particular professional decision of someone who chose informality over authority, who'd learned that the first word a caller heard set the temperature of everything that followed. She said, "My name is Nora Voss. I'm 16. I don't have a guardian. I found something that I think requires a lawyer, and I need someone who will listen to me before they start deciding what to do." A pause on the line. Not a long one. "All right," Ruth said. "I'm listening." Those 2 words. Nora stood at the payphone on the edge of Caldwell and felt something in her chest loosen, some tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd stopped registering it as tension and started registering it as just the weight of existing. She'd been waiting since December for someone to say that. She hadn't known she was waiting. She knew it now. She told Ruth. Not everything, not the vault, not the numbers. She told her about the library, about the journal, about the panel in the wall, and the stairs, and the door she'd found. She told her she needed someone to verify what she'd seen and help her understand what it meant legally before anyone else was involved. Ruth didn't interrupt. Didn't ask about her housing situation or her school enrollment status or whether she'd filed a report with any agency. When Nora finished, there was a short silence. "Can you meet me at the building tomorrow morning? 8 o'clock? "Yes." "Bring the journal." That was all. Ruth arrived the next morning at 7:55, on foot, which Nora had not expected. She'd imagined a car, a briefcase, the visual language of someone whose help costs something. Ruth had a canvas bag over one shoulder and wore a coat that had seen several winters and was warm. She was in her late 40s, dark hair going gray at the temples, the kind of face that had formed its expressions through use rather than performance. She stood at the gate and looked at the building for a long moment before looking at Nora. She looked at the limestone walls, the intact roof, the boarded windows. She was doing the same thing Nora had done on the first night reading the building, assessing the difference between condemned and actually fallen. "You've been living in there." Not a question. Nora didn't confirm or deny it. Ruth nodded once, as though she'd confirmed it herself through whatever calculation she'd run. "Show me the door." They went in through the east basement passage, because the front board was now nailed shut and Nora wanted to demonstrate she'd thought about access. Ruth moved through the low passage without complaint, emerged in the basement utility room, followed Nora through the main floor and the reference section and the archives room without speaking. She looked at everything they passed, the shelves, the books, the card catalog, with an attention that was quiet and specific. At one point she stopped beside the children's section and looked at the low shelves, the books still standing upright in their places, and something crossed her face that she didn't comment on. At the last bookshelf, Nora moved the books. Ruth watched. When the shelf rolled, Ruth stepped forward and touched the edge of the panel. How long did it take you to find this? 4 days after I found the journal. She showed Ruth the journal. Ruth read the November 1951 entry, the November 1955 entry, and the final March 1963 entry. She read each one twice, the way Nora had read them the first time. She didn't say anything while she was reading, and she didn't perform a reaction when she'd finished. She handed the journal back and waited. Take me down. They went down the 8 stairs. At the vault door, Nora turned the wheel. The mechanism gave way in the same sequence it always did, and she pulled the door open. Ruth stood in the doorway. The flashlight was in Nora's hand, and she moved it across the room, the shelves, the bars, the drawers, the letter in its frame in the same slow arc she'd made the first time, months ago, when she'd stood in this same doorway and felt the particular silence of a sealed room opening. Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she walked into the room. She went directly to the letter, read it in full without touching the glass, moved her lips slightly on one line, the one Nora had read the most. Whatever has come here. She turned around and looked at the shelves, both sides of the room, the length of the aisle. How long has this been here? The journal says 1951, and Hargrove died in 1963, July, without heirs. Ruth looked at her then, full attention, the kind of attention that meant she was assessing something, and what she was assessing was whether the 16-year-old in front of her understood what she'd found. You've done research on the estate. Ohio Revised Code, 1998 edition. Upstairs. I spent 3 hours on the sections about unclaimed property and intestate succession. The vault wasn't in his documented will. His estate was settled without anyone knowing this existed. Ruth's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it confirmed. You know what this means, legally. I know what I couldn't figure out, Nora said. I know the gap. I don't know what fills it. What fills it, Ruth said, is complicated, and it will require more than me. But that's tomorrow's problem. She looked at the room again, at the bars, steady and matte and present on their shelves. Today's problem is making sure nothing happens to this until we know exactly what we're dealing with. She came back the next day with a colleague, a man named David Park who specialized in estate law, and a locksmith who rekeyed the east basement passage door and gave Nora the only copy of the new key. Ruth explained this with the directness that Nora had come to understand was simply how she operated. You found it. Until a court says otherwise, you're the responsible party. That means you hold the key. Nora held the key. The process that followed was not fast. She'd known it wouldn't be fast. David Park filed a motion to stay any city action on the building while the estate matter was under review. A probate judge was assigned. The city was notified that there was a legal proceeding touching its condemned property. The notification arrived at the city manager's office on a Thursday afternoon in January, 3 weeks after Nora had made the call from the payphone. And the city manager, a man named Gerald Stroud, read it and called his attorney, and the attorney called the city council, and by Friday morning the existence of a legal proceeding involving the Hargrove Library had become something that people in Caldwell were talking about. Not the vault. Not yet. The city didn't know about the vault. The motion David had filed referenced the Hargrove estate and a potential asset claim without specifying what the asset was. He'd done this deliberately. The moment we say gold, he told Nora, in a meeting at Ruth's office where Nora sat across a real desk from 2 lawyers who were on her side. The media becomes part of the equation. We control the information until we're ready for the information to be public. Nora understood controlling information. She'd been controlling information her whole life, deciding what to tell which person and when, managing the picture other people had of her situation with a precision born of knowing that the wrong information in the wrong hands had consequences she could feel in her body. She was very good at controlling information. What she wasn't good at, and was learning, was being managed. Ruth was careful with her, gave her documents before meetings, explained processes, asked for her views before acting. David was more direct, sometimes forgettingly so, sliding into the mode of a professional solving a problem and forgetting briefly that the problem's origin was a person sitting in the room. When this happened, Ruth would bring him back with a single look, and he'd correct, and Nora would file the moment away as data about how the people around her operated. She'd been moved to a hotel room by Ruth's organization, a modest room on the second floor of a place on the edge of town that charged by the week. It had heat and a shower and a bed and a window that looked at a parking lot. Nora had stood at the window on the first night in the room and looked at the parking lot for a long time, not because there was anything to see, but because the standing was different now. She was standing somewhere that was, for the moment, hers. Not borrowed. Not temporary by institutional logic. Hers for as long as the process took, which Ruth had said would be at least several months. Several months. She'd never had several months of anything that stayed the same. Houses changed, people changed, the rules changed without notice. She stood at the window of the hotel room and understood that the parking lot was going to look like that parking lot tomorrow too, and that the room behind her was going to keep being her room until something specific and named happened to change it, not until someone decided it was time to move her along. She thought about the library every day. She went back when she could, when Ruth or David needed her present for the legal team's inspection of the vault, which happened twice in the first month of formal inventory conducted by a court-appointed appraiser named Helen Torres, a small methodical woman who spent 6 hours in the basement room with measuring tools and reference books and a camera, cataloging every bar and every coin and every document and the letter in its frame. Nora sat on the stairs during the appraisal, not in the room, not watching exactly, but present, because being present felt like the right thing and also because Ruth had said she should be. Helen Torres came back up the stairs at the end of 6 hours with a clipboard and a face that gave nothing away. "I'll have the preliminary figures in 10 days, she told David. "Ballpark," David said. Helen Torres looked at him. Then she looked at Nora. Whatever she read in Nora's face made her choose directness over caution. The bar gold alone, at current spot price, is in the high 300s to low 400s million. The coin collection adds significantly on top of that. Some of those coins are, she paused, chose a word, remarkable. I'll need additional specialist appraisal for the numismatic pieces. But ballpark, as you asked, the total is somewhere in the range of 450 to 500 million. The number was almost exactly what Nora had calculated in the public library branch 3 weeks ago, sitting at the terminal with scratch paper and the current gold price. David let out a long breath. Ruth looked at Nora. Nora said, "That's what I thought." The city found out 12 days later. Not because anyone from their team told the city, because Gerald Stroud had hired his own researcher, who'd found the probate filing and cross-referenced it against the building's records and dug until he found the connection to the Hargrove estate, and then kept digging until he found a reference, buried in the probate motion's supporting documents, to assets discovered within the building structure. Stroud called a city council meeting on a Tuesday night. Nora wasn't there. Ruth was. David was. The city's position, expressed through their attorney in language Nora later read in the meeting transcript, was that any assets discovered within a city-owned condemned building were city property. Ruth's response, also in the transcript, was 7 pages. The version she gave Nora to read was annotated in the margins with Ruth's handwriting. On the 4th page, next to the section arguing that Hargrove's letter constituted an expression of testamentary intent directed at whoever found the vault, Ruth had written, "Strong." In the margin next to the section about Nora's position as the discovering party, "This is the harder argument. We're working it." Nora read the annotations, put the document down, picked it back up and read it again. "What's the harder argument?" she asked at their next meeting. "Whether a minor, without legal guardianship, has standing to make a claim as a discovering party. And we're filing a motion to have a guardian ad litem appointed, someone who represents your interests specifically, to give you standing independent of the system." Nora thought about that. Who decides who it is? The court proposes someone. We can object and request alternatives. I want to meet them before the court appoints them. Ruth looked at her. That's not standard process. I know. I want to do it anyway. Ruth wrote something in her notebook. I'll see what I can do. She did. The guardian ad litem was a woman named Carol Mead, a former family court judge who'd moved to private practice and took a limited number of cases like this one, cases that required someone with the particular skill of representing a child's interests in a proceeding where adults with resources were arguing about money. She met Nora on a Thursday in February in Ruth's conference room, and the first thing she said after sitting down was, "Tell me what you want. Not what happened. Not what you found. What you want." Nora told her. What she wanted was for the library to reopen, not as a condition of any settlement, not as a term she was negotiating for, but as the outcome she believed Edmund Hargrove had intended, and that the gold in the basement had always been meant to fund. She wanted the building decondemned and restored and operated as a public library, with a permanent endowment drawn from the vault's value that the city couldn't exhaust this time, because the terms of the endowment would be structured to prevent what had happened before. She wanted this documented, legally, in whatever form made it permanent. And for yourself? Carol asked. Nora said she wanted what she was legally entitled to as the discovering party, whatever that was under Ohio law, and she wanted it managed until she was 18 in a way that couldn't be accessed or redirected by the state. She wanted to finish high school. She wanted to go to college. She wanted these things to be real, not promises that existed on printed sheets with waiting lists. Carol wrote everything down. Then she looked up and said, "You're very clear. I've had a lot of time to think about it. How long were you in the building before you called Ruth?" "About 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Alone? Yes. Carol was quiet for a moment. She wasn't performing empathy. Nora had seen enough performed empathy to know the difference between the real thing and the technique. This was just a woman sitting with information and letting it be what it was. "All right," Carol said. "Let's build you something that holds." The public announcement came in March. By then, the probate court had issued a preliminary ruling that the vault's contents were not city property, they were assets of the Hargrove estate, which had been improperly closed without knowledge of a significant holding, and therefore the estate was to be reopened and properly administered. The city's attorney appealed. The appeal was denied within 3 weeks, on the grounds that the original ruling was supported by Hargrove's own documented letter, his journal, and the structural evidence of deliberate concealment rather than abandonment. David called her when the appeal denial came through. He said the word denied and then stopped talking. And in the silence, she understood that a man who was professionally trained to be measured was measuring himself carefully right now because he was pleased and wanted to let that be clear. "That's good," she said. "That's very good," he said. She called Ruth next. Ruth said, "I know. David called me first. I told him to call you." A pause. "How are you feeling?" She thought about it. She was sitting in the hotel room at the desk by the window, the parking lot outside, the winter light flat and pale. She was thinking about the library, about the reading room, about what it was going to look like when the boards came off the windows. "Ready," she said. The press release went out on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Caldwell was on the news. Nora had been prepared for this by Ruth, who'd sat with her the afternoon before and gone through what to expect. The cameras, the questions that would be asked, the tone that some of the coverage would take, not hostile exactly, but framed as a discovery story, a treasure story, a remarkable coincidence story, without quite capturing what it actually was. "They'll ask about your circumstances," Ruth said. "I know. You don't have to answer questions about your housing situation or your foster history. I know that too. What are you going to say?" Nora thought about it. "I'm going to say that I found the library, and that I read the journal, and that Edmund Hargrove asked for someone to make a decision he'd be proud of, and I'm trying to." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "That's exactly right." The cameras came. Nora stood on the steps of the Hargrove Library. The boards were still on the windows, the yellow sign still on the fence, the plywood still in place, and she said what she'd said she would say. The reporters asked follow-up questions. She answered what she chose to answer. She was 16, and she was very calm, and she noticed, as the questions continued, that the reporters had not expected calm. They'd expected a child who was overwhelmed, who was crying, who needed the story explained to her. She was not that. She was the person who had read the journal in 30-second lighter intervals and done the math in the public library and spent 3 weeks thinking carefully about what she wanted before she asked for it. Gerald Stroud gave a statement that afternoon. It was measured, political, the kind of statement that said very little while appearing to say a great deal. He expressed the city's commitment to a just resolution. He expressed admiration for Nora's resourcefulness. He did not express anything about the city's legal attempt to claim the vault, which had failed. The town's reaction was complicated, the way towns' reactions to things always are when the thing in question disrupts the story a town has been telling itself. Caldwell had been telling itself for 3 years that the library was not viable, that the building was a liability, that the closure had been the only reasonable decision. The emergence of $460 million from the building's basement did not fit neatly into that story. Some people said she was brave. Some people said she was lucky, which Nora found, privately, the most interesting response of all, because luck was what people called things they couldn't explain when the explanation required acknowledging that someone they'd overlooked had paid attention in ways they hadn't. She had noticed the building. She had climbed the fence. She had moved the shelf. None of those things were luck. They were choices made by a person nobody had thought to watch. A man named Franklin, who sat on the city council and had voted for the closure, gave an interview in which he said that the city would have found the vault eventually, and that the entire situation had been unnecessarily complicated by the involvement of a minor. He said this on camera, and the camera captured the face of the reporter listening to him say it, which was perhaps the most useful thing that camera had done all day. Ruth sent Nora a copy of the clip without commentary. Nora watched it once and felt, not triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of a person who has been called a complication by someone who needed them to be a complication and has survived that framing intact. Mr. Patrice gave no statement. Nora had been told he'd been reached for comment and had declined. She thought about him occasionally, about the 40 seconds he'd spent reviewing her file, about the way he'd said she fell under a different set of service categories. She didn't feel anger, exactly. She felt something closer to the specific sorrow that came from thinking about systems and the people who operated them, honestly believing that operating a system was the same thing as seeing the people inside it. Linda Greer called Ruth's office and asked if there was anything she could do. Ruth, who knew Nora's history, relayed the message exactly as it had been delivered and waited for Nora's response. Nora's response was, "Tell her I don't need anything." She thought about that for a day afterward. She wasn't angry at Linda Greer. Not exactly. Linda had operated by the rules of the system she was part of, and the system's rules had produced the corner of Melton and 4th at 18 degrees on a Tuesday night in December. The rules were wrong. Linda had followed them. Those were two separate things, and conflating them was easy but not quite accurate. What she felt, thinking about Linda Greer, was the particular exhaustion of having been someone whose existence required other people to decide what to do with her. She was done being that person. She was done being a category in someone's system. She was Nora Voss, who had read a dead man's journal by lighter flame and turned a vault wheel that hadn't moved in 60 years and called a payphone number on a Wednesday morning and said, "I need someone who will listen to me before they start deciding what to do." She had been heard. Several former foster parents and group home staff members who'd had nothing to do with Nora's case contacted legal aid or the press in the weeks after the story broke, people wanting to claim adjacency to the outcome in ways that ranged from touching to uncomfortable. One woman who'd been a house parent at the Westfield group home, not Barbara. Someone else wrote a long social media post about the importance of believing in the potential of every child in the system, illustrated with photographs that didn't include Nora. Nora saw the post and felt nothing in particular. Then she thought about Barbara, who'd told her the system was not designed for her, and she should know that and plan accordingly, and felt something warmer. She never found Barbara. She looked. Barbara had moved out of state after the group home closed. But she thought, sometimes, that if Barbara was out there reading the news, she would have recognized what had happened as exactly the kind of outcome you prepared for when you told a child the truth about their situation. Not luck. Preparation. The formal appraisal was completed in April. The final figure, inclusive of Helen Torres's specialist consultation on the rare coins and a secondary review by a commodities expert brought in by the court, was $463 million. She heard the number in Carol Mead's office, with Ruth and David also present, and the room was very quiet for a moment after Carol read it from the document. David said, "That's yes," Ruth said. Carol looked at Nora. "How are you?" Nora thought about it genuinely, which she did now as a habit. She'd learned that Carol's questions were actual questions, not conversational filler, and deserved actual answers. "I'm thinking about the library," she said. Carol smiled. "The real kind." The settlement terms were finalized in June, 6 months after the Wednesday morning at the payphone. The Hargrove estate was formally reopened and administered by a court-appointed executor. Under Ohio's unclaimed property and finders doctrine, as applied to the specific circumstances, a minor, a discovered asset in a building with an improperly closed estate, a letter constituting testamentary direction, Nora was recognized as the primary discovering party with a documented claim. 30% of the vault's total appraised value, $138 million, was placed in a structured trust in Nora's name, managed until her 21st birthday by Carol Mead, and a financial administrator of Nora's choosing, with access provisions for her education, housing, and necessities in the interim. The remaining 70% went to the Hargrove Library Restoration and Perpetual Endowment Fund. This was Nora's proposal. David had argued for a different split. Ruth had suggested a middle ground. Carol had presented Nora's position to the court without modification. The judge, a woman named Patricia Hayes who had read the case file and Hargrove's letter and Nora's written statement in full, approved the split with a comment in her ruling that Nora would read 20 times over the following weeks. The discovering party has demonstrated, throughout this proceeding, a clarity of intention that is unusual in matters of this complexity. Her proposal regarding the disposition of the vault's assets reflects a coherent understanding of the original owner's intent that this court finds not only valid but admirable. The Hargrove Library Restoration Fund will receive its allocation, as proposed, with the full endorsement of this court. Nora held the printed ruling in her hands in Carol's office and read that paragraph again. Set it down. Looked out the window at the June Street. What are you thinking? Carol asked. He would have been proud of this, Nora said. That's what he asked for. He would have been proud. The library reopened on a Saturday in September. They'd worked fast. With sufficient resources, the boards came down in July, the windows cleaned in August, the structural assessment completed, and the necessary repairs made. None of them the catastrophic failures the city had implied when it condemned the building. The roof needed repointing in 2 sections. 2 windows needed new glazing. The wiring needed updating. The heating system, which had been shut off for 3 years, needed servicing but not replacement. The building itself, the limestone walls and the tin panel ceilings and the oak shelves and the brass ladder tracks, was sound. It had always been sound. It had been told to stop trying. It had not stopped trying. It had just been waiting. The books were cleaned but not replaced. Most of them were still perfectly viable, and the ones that weren't were cataloged and donated or respectfully retired. New acquisitions would fill the gaps. Margaret Olson's card catalog was preserved exactly as she'd left it, in the south wall cabinet with its hundreds of small drawers, as a permanent record of what the library had been. A new digital system would run alongside it. Nora was there on the day the boards came down. She'd asked to be, and nobody had said no. She stood on the pavement outside the fence, which was now open, the gate unpadlocked, the chain coiled neatly on top of the post, and watched the crew pull the plywood from the first window. The glass behind it caught the July sun and threw a long rectangle of light across the reading room floor, visible from outside, a clean bright stripe across the dark wood of the tables. She stood there for a long time. Behind her, a voice. "Excuse me." She turned. An older woman, maybe 70, standing on the sidewalk looking at the building. "Are they reopening it?" the woman asked. "Yes," Nora said. "In September." The woman looked at the building. Something moved across her face that Nora recognized as the particular expression of someone who had missed something and was only now understanding how much. "My daughter used to come here every Saturday," the woman said. "When she was small. Every Saturday. We'd get a stack and go home and have lunch, and she'd read all afternoon." She paused. "She's a librarian now. In Columbus." Nora thought about the children's section. The small shelves at the right height. The illustration above the reading nook, a child under a tree with an open book, faded but still clear. "She should come back," Nora said. "When it opens." The woman looked at her. "Are you the girl?" "The one who found the yes," Nora said. The woman didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Simply, the way people say things that are too large for the available words and know it and say the small thing anyway, because saying nothing would be worse. Nora nodded. The woman walked on. Nora turned back to the building, to the window with the light coming through it, to the reading room beyond it, to the card catalog against the south wall, and the brass tracks, and the oak shelves, and the books in their places. She was 17 now. She'd had a birthday in the middle of all of it, June, during the settlement negotiations. Ruth had brought a cake to the office. Carol had been there. David had been there, and had sung slightly off-key and apologized for it. Nora had sat at the conference table with a piece of chocolate cake and people on her side and thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Not wealth. Not the settlement figures. Not the number that Helen Torres had read from the clipboard in the basement. Those were real. and she understood they were going to change the mechanics of her life in ways she was still processing. But they weren't what the birthday in the conference room felt like. It felt like the table, like people who knew her name and had chosen to be in the same room with her. Like Ruth's canvas bag in the corner and David's off-key singing and Carol's expression of quiet amusement and the simple fact that no one in the room was there because they'd been assigned her. She was going to finish her last year of high school in Caldwell, enrolled at the public school, with an address a real one, a rented house 2 blocks from Hargrove Avenue, small but proper, hers that she'd given the enrollment office without having to calculate the risk. She was going to apply to colleges in the spring. She'd been reading about programs, the way she'd always read, broadly and with attention, and she'd found herself drawn toward library science, which surprised her only until it didn't. She was going to build something. Not yet. Not at 17. But eventually, in the way that eventually felt real now instead of hypothetical, she was going to build something that held. She thought about what it meant to hold. She'd spent a long time in places that didn't. She understood now, in a way she hadn't when she was 8 or 11 or even 16 standing at the corner of Melton and 4th, that the difference between a place that held and a place that didn't was not luck. It was construction. It was materials chosen carefully and work done right, and someone who believed enough in what they were building to put their name on it and mean it. Hargrove had believed. He'd built the library and then built the vault and then written a letter to whoever came, because he believed someone would come and believed that when they came they'd understand. She had come. She understood. The library opened on the last Saturday of September, 9 months after a Tuesday night in December when a girl with a garbage bag and a worn paperback and a half-empty lighter had climbed a chain-link fence and found a warped board and decided the building it led to wasn't actually beyond saving. The restoration had taken 3 months from the date the settlement was finalized. With sufficient resources and a building whose bones had never actually been compromised, 3 months was enough. The crew who worked the building in July and August reported that the job was, by any structural assessment, a restoration rather than a repair. They were returning something to its intended state, not rebuilding from damage. The roof needed repointing in 2 sections. 2 windows needed new glazing. The wiring needed updating throughout. The heating system needed servicing, but not replacement. The heating had simply been off. That was the thing about the building that the restoration crew noted in their formal report, in language that was professional and contained, but that Nora read and set down and picked back up again. The report said the building's envelope had remained intact during the period of closure. The structural systems were sound. The materials, selected in 1947 by a man who had spent his professional life in environments where engineering failure meant real consequences, had done what they were designed to do. The building had not deteriorated. It had waited. The books were cleaned, but not replaced. Most of them were still perfectly viable. The sealed envelope that had preserved the bar gold in the basement had preserved the paper above it too, in the particular way that things built to hold one thing held adjacent things as well. The ones that weren't viable were cataloged and respectfully retired. New acquisitions would fill the gaps, funded by the endowment that was now structured in a way the city couldn't erode, a permanent fund administered by an independent board with specific spending restrictions that had been negotiated by David and written into the settlement with the precision of someone who had read the 2018 Town Council report and understood exactly what had gone wrong the first time. Margaret Olson's card catalog was preserved exactly as she'd left it, in the south wall cabinet with its hundreds of small drawers, as a permanent record of what the library had been and who had tended it. A small plaque went up beside the cabinet with her name and the years she'd served, because Nora had asked for it, and Carol had made sure it happened. Hargrove's letter in its glass frame was moved from the vault to a display case in the reading room, set between the circulation desk and the bronze plaque by the front door. Anyone could read it now. Whoever has come here. The letter was out of the basement and into the light, and whoever came through the red door would see it within the first 10 steps. Nora was there on the day the boards came down. She'd asked to be, and nobody had said no. She stood on the pavement outside the fence now open, the gate unpadlocked, the chain coiled neatly on top of the post, and watched the crew pull the plywood from the first window. The glass behind it caught the July sun and threw a long rectangle of light across the reading room floor, visible from outside, a clean bright stripe across the dark wood of the tables. She stood there for a long time. Behind her, a voice. "Excuse me." She turned. An older woman, maybe 70, standing on the sidewalk looking at the building. "Are they reopening it?" the woman asked. "Yes," Nora said. "In September." The woman looked at the building. Something moved across her face that Nora recognized as the particular expression of someone who had missed something and was only now understanding how much. "My daughter used to come here every Saturday," the woman said. "When she was small. Every Saturday. We'd get a stack and go home and have lunch, and she'd read all afternoon." She paused. "She's a librarian now. In Columbus." Nora thought about the children's section. The small shelves at the right height. The illustration above the reading nook. A child under a tree with an open book, faded but still clear. "She should come back," Nora said. "When it opens." The woman looked at her. "Are you the girl?" "The one who found the yes," Nora said. The woman didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Simply, the way people say things that are too large for the available words and know it and say the small thing anyway, because saying nothing would be worse. Nora nodded. The woman walked on. Nora turned back to the building, to the window with the light coming through it, to the reading room beyond it, to the card catalog against the south wall, and the brass tracks, and the oak shelves, and the books in their places. The reopening was announced for the last Saturday in September. In the weeks between the board removal in July and the opening, the town's response shifted. People stopped outside the fence to watch the work being done. A few of them introduced themselves to the crew, asked questions. Someone left flowers at the gate, tied to the chain link with a ribbon. The sign that said "Condemned" came down on a Wednesday, and people drove past to look at where it had been, the way you look at the space where something painful used to be when it's finally been removed. The line formed before 9 in the morning. Not because anyone had expected a line. The reopening had been announced, but the town had been cautious in its response, as towns are cautious when something has been lost for long enough that hope has stopped feeling safe. Cautious meaning people weren't sure if they were allowed to want this, weren't sure if the story that had ended badly could actually become a story that ended well. Caldwell had been making peace with things ending for a long time. The mill, the diner, the library. A list of closures that had been accepted not because anyone wanted to accept them, but because accepting them was what you did when you ran out of other options. But the line formed anyway. Families with children. Older people who remembered the building before it was boarded, who had memories stored in these rooms the way the rooms had stored their books, shelved and available for retrieval when the right moment arrived. People who hadn't read a physical book in years and found themselves, on this particular Saturday, wanting to. The woman whose daughter was a librarian in Columbus was there, near the front, and the daughter was with her, home for the weekend. Ruth was there. Carol was there. David was there with his wife and their 2 kids, who ran for the children's section the moment the doors opened, and could be heard from the front steps, making noise about books they recognized. Helen Torres, the appraiser, was there, which surprised Nora and then didn't. She'd come down those stairs and done 6 hours of careful work in the basement, and she'd looked at the gold the way people look at the end of a long question. Of course she'd come to see what it had become. At 10 o'clock, the red door opened. Nora was the one who opened it. She'd asked for that too, and nobody had said no. She turned the handle and pushed the door, and the light of a September morning came through into the reading room, falling on the clean tables and the oak shelves and the card catalog and the brass tracks, falling on the books in their places, falling on the bronze plaque beside the door. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge given freely is the only lasting thing. People came in around her. She stepped to the side and let them come. Let the building fill with the sound of people moving in it and children running in it, and the particular noise of a place being used again after a long time of not being used. The children's section produced exactly the sound she'd imagined. Voices and the sliding of books being pulled from shelves and the sound of small feet on hardwood. She stood by the plaque for a moment. She thought about what she knew now, that she hadn't known in December. She knew that the difference between a building that stood and a building that fell was not the building. It was whether anyone kept showing up. She knew that the gap between a system that protected children and a system that managed them was navigable, if you paid attention and asked the right questions and held out for someone who listened before they acted. She knew that gold was heavy in your hands and lighter when you'd given most of it away. She knew that Jane Eyre was right about the independent will. She knew that paper mattered, even paper that hurt. She knew that whoever had come here could leave here different. She left through the red door and stood on the stone steps in the September sun, and the line was still going in behind her, and the building was full of sound, and the vault in the basement was empty now, its contents converted, its shelves bare, its letter in its glass frame moved to a display case in the reading room where anyone could read it, and the building above it was no longer condemned. It was open. It was lit. The brass tracks had a ladder on them. She stood on the steps and let herself feel it. Not triumph, that wasn't the right word for what she felt. Something quieter. The particular satisfaction of a thing resolved, of a weight carried long enough and then set down in exactly the right place. Caldwell was still Caldwell. The mill was still 30 miles down the highway. The storefronts with paper in their windows were still there. Mr. Patrice was still at his desk, probably, reviewing files for 40 seconds at a time. The world had not been fixed. One library's reopening and one vault's contents did not fix the world. But something had happened here. Something specific and real. And it was going to keep happening. The books were going to keep being read. The endowment was going to keep being funded. The children's section was going to keep being the right height for small hands reaching up. The storytelling series had already been announced for January, the first one in 3 years. The woman from Columbus was going to drive down from Columbus for it, probably. She had that look about her, standing in line with her mother on the September sidewalk, the look of someone reconnecting with something they'd been missing without knowing they'd been missing it. She thought about what Hargrove would say, if he could say anything. If 70 years after walking up those 8 stairs for the last time, he could see who had come down them. She didn't think he'd be surprised by the circumstances. The man who'd written "Whoever has come here" had imagined a wide range of possibilities. What she thought he'd recognize was the attention, the care she'd taken with his journal, the way she'd restacked his books in order, the way she'd understood without being told that the building above and the vault below were part of the same intention. He'd believed in whoever came. She was who came. She thought about the chain of it. The woman on the payphone at 15 cents. The 2 words Ruth had said. The key the locksmith had given her. The 6 hours Helen Torres had spent in the basement. The rulings Patricia Hayes had written. The cake David had brought to the June meeting, and the singing, off-key. The way Carol Meade had looked at her across the conference table and said, "Tell me what you want," and written down the answer without editorializing. She thought about Barbara, somewhere out of state, not knowing. She thought about Diane, who'd called a 16-year-old's attention a gift. She thought about the library in Perrysburg where she hadn't been a member, exactly, but had used the building anyway, and the librarian there who'd never asked her to leave. She thought about the hook by the door where the coat wasn't on the hook one Thursday afternoon in October when she was 8 years old. She thought about how much had changed since then. She thought about what hadn't changed, which was what she was: a person who paid attention, who read carefully, who held on to paper that mattered, who noticed when things were different and followed the difference to see where it led. That was who she'd been at 8. That was who she'd been at 16, climbing a chain-link fence in the dark. That was who she was now, standing on stone steps in September sun, while behind her a building filled with people and sound. She pulled Jane Eyre from her backpack. The same copy still. Spine cracked, pages soft. She'd bought a new one months ago, a nicer edition, clean pages, and a proper binding. She kept carrying this one. She sat on the stone steps of the Hargrove Public Library in September sunlight and opened to a page and read, and behind her the building was full of people and sound and light. And in the basement the vault was empty, and the letter said "Whoever," and somewhere in Caldwell, Ohio, a 16-year-old girl had been replaced, quietly and without announcement, by a 17-year-old girl who had a key and an address and a future that had been, finally, properly built. She turned a page. The September light moved across the stone steps, warm and unhurried. The light of a season that was still itself even as it began its slow turn towards something colder. Inside the library, David's children were being loud in the children's section, and someone was asking a question at the circulation desk, the first question asked at that desk in 3 years, and the new librarian was answering it. The brass ladder tracks had a ladder on them, and somewhere on the 3rd floor a man in his 60s was standing on that ladder reaching for a volume he remembered from 40 years ago. The bronze plaque on the wall beside the red door caught the morning light and held it. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge given freely is the only lasting thing. She'd read those words the first morning she'd woken up in the library, standing in front of the plaque with her fingers still cold and her jacket still failing and the water from the drinking fountain still on her lips. She'd read them and thought about Edmund Hargrove and wanted to understand him. She understood him now, well enough to say that he would have recognized this Saturday. The line, the children, the returning woman from Columbus. He would have seen the light coming through the clean windows and known it was what the light was supposed to do, falling on a reading room that was being read in. He would have been proud. She turned another page. Behind her, a child laughed in the children's section, a loud and unself-conscious laugh, the kind that didn't know it was being listened to and wouldn't have cared. The sound traveled out through the open red door and into the September morning and dissolved into the sounds of the street, a car passing, a dog somewhere, the ordinary sounds of a town that was still itself even as something inside it had shifted. She sat on the steps and read. Edmund Hargrove descended the 8 stairs for the last time on a Tuesday morning in June of 1963, for weeks before his body decided it was done. He knew it was the last time. A man of 73 who had spent his professional life making assessments knew the difference between temporary difficulty and permanent conclusion. His doctor had used the word months, and Hargrove had not asked for clarification. He'd driven to the library, let himself in with the key he'd kept since the building opened, walked through the reading room he'd funded, and the archives he'd stocked, and the room at the back that held his technical library on its dark shelves. He moved the books himself. He'd always moved them himself. The shelf rolled the way it always had, requiring effort, yielding to it. The panel opened. He descended. Inside the vault, he stood with a flashlight and looked at what 50 years of careful work had built. The bars on their steel shelves, accumulated slowly through sources that kept no record of his name. The coin trays in their drawers, each piece labeled in his own hand, a system that made sense to him and would make sense to whoever was patient enough to read it. He'd always believed in patience, in the particular intelligence of people who were willing to be slow about things that mattered. He crossed the room and stood in front of the frame he'd mounted on the wall the previous year, when he understood the timeline was narrowing. He read the letter through the glass the way a person reads something they've written and need to hear again to know whether it says what they meant. Whoever has come here. He thought about that word. Whoever. He'd chosen it with more care than it appeared to contain. Not a specific person, not a lawyer or an archivist or a city official. Anyone. Anyone with patience enough to find the journal and intelligence enough to read it and determination enough to move the shelf and press the latch and descend the stairs. He'd trusted the building to find that person. Buildings were patient in ways that people weren't. A building built well, from good stone by careful hands, outlasted the intentions of its occupants by decades. By generations, sometimes. By whatever time it needed to find the right use. He thought the library might stand long enough. He'd built it to stand long enough. He took one last look at the rows of bars, at the coin drawers, at the letter in its frame. He turned off the flashlight. He stood in the complete dark of the vault for a moment. The dark that had no wind in it and no sound from the street and no urgency of any kind. Only the particular silence of something that had been sealed and would stay sealed until whoever came. Then he went back up the stairs. He moved the shelf. He res-tacked the books precisely. He drove home. He was content. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.